After the huge disappointment I had experiencing the newly released Mighty Morphin Power Rangers Rita's Rewind game, I decided that I deserved a palate cleanser. So what better way is there to do that than creating an epically huge compilation video covering all of the big hits and hidden gems of the modern beaten up Renaissance period. That's right, in this video we will champion and celebrate pure quality. So let's look at all of the best games from the last few years and what made them great. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hats here. These are the bougiest of beat 'em ups that you need to add to your collection. Yeah! The modern retro gaming beat 'em up revival, what a time to be alive. But the real knockout here, I can hook you up with a massive discount on some of the best games in the whole genre. How about 60% off the pulse pounding Streets of Rage 4? Or maybe a whopping 78% off the epic River City Girls series? And don't miss the electrifying Double Dragon Gaiden slashed by 80% to just $5.19. Wow, but that's not all. By using my affiliate links you can score up to 90% off on thousands of other games too. So if you've been eyeing some new titles for your collection, now's the time to strike. Why wait? Treat yourself, you all deserve it. Anyway, let's look back at my personal favourite modern releases. There's so many good ones.
Do you remember the classic 1990s cartoon Fight and Rage? The adventures of Gal, Norris and Ricardo fighting against the powerful villains that have conquered humanity after disastrous EMP has destroyed human society. Well, that wasn't a real show, and if you said yes, you're a dirty, dirty liar. Fight and Rage is a modern multiplayer beat 'em up created by one man, Sebastian Garcia, as a homage to both the legendary 90s belt action brawlers such as Streets of Rage and Final Fight, and the 90s extreme cartoons that frequently focused on superpowered heroes fighting against incredible odds. Long-time viewers of the channel will know I have a fascination and outright addiction to beat 'em ups, a genre known as belt action games in Japan, as you're constantly walking down a belt of land that enemies constantly come down. When video games shifted from 2D to 3D, this is one of the genres that just didn't successfully make the jump. While Fighting Force was once planned to be Streets of Rage 4, the title was met with middling reviews and was largely the last gasp for adventures of warriors walking down alleys and beating up strangers. 3D just happened to be built for more adventurous explorations of the world, and with the expansion of storage mediums, games that would feature players beating up one another have gone for a more narrative approach. While you can walk around in Vice City and beat people up, it's hard to call that anything but an adventure action title. But Sebastian Garcia clearly has a love for the genre, and this one-man company under the name of Seba Games Dev would release his love letter to the 90s with Fight and Rage, a completely original property. The original version of the title would release in September 2017, with releases on the PC, Windows, Switch, Xbox One and PlayStation 4. Thanks to the backwards compatibility, or well, the fact that these consoles and computers are still around, means that while released late in the last generation of gaming, the title is still readily available on all modern consoles. Looking at the title, you'll instantly see a few inspirations. While gameplay may be based on classic Konami Ninja Turtles games, visually the game appears to be a spiritual retread of series such as the Cowboys of Moon Mesa, Biker Mice from Mars, and any other 90s post-apocalyptic but kids-safe adventures with mutant animal men. Who remembers Street Sharks? And by the way, Cowboys of Moon Mesa, it's been a while since I covered that underrated arcade game. Set in a far future, Earth was devastated by mutants who took control after a worldwide catastrophic event known as the Big Pulse. A global-scale electromagnetic pulse that put an end to all electronic technology on the planet. Humans are now enslaved by mutants led by the Boss, in a world ruled by the law of the jungle. However, not everything is lost. Two humans and a mutant rebel are willing to fight in order to stop this madness. Will they be strong enough? Well, that's up to you. Sounds a bit like Planet of the Apes, where a ragtag human or team fight against their vastly physical superior mutant animal overlords. The story of the Fight and Rage universe will change as you progress through the branching paths and decisions over the course of a playthrough. Solid experienced players can knock out a route in an hour, if you can get past that final boss, which I've always struggled with. so you'll see a few different permutations of the story if you sit down for a day and explore. Or honestly, you can also choose not to explore. A few times in my gameplay I've found that indecision in itself is a decision. Choosing not to aid a team of rebels in their fight against your subjugators will lead to them being slaughtered, and your player character having to grapple with their cowardice, leading to the death of others. The main trio of heroes you'll take up in this adventure will appropriately fill all the stereotypes of a beat-em-up. The most unique design of the trio is Ricardo, a Minotaur human rights activist based loosely off of Mayor Mike Haggar. Clearly the bruiser of the bunch, he's a dominating force with a long reach, focusing on powerful attacks and taking a significant amount of hits. F. Norris, a likely play on Chuck Norris, an amusing name I'm not going to rhyme because of the absurdly tyrannical nature of the YouTube gods. This character is the ninja of a title. Norris is the weakest of the three, but appropriately balances reach, power and speed with his ninjutsu style. Lastly, but probably first for all the men of culture that follow this channel, is Gao, the kickboxing wow Gao, who has some great jiggle physics applied to her design. She has escaped from the human traders. Her variant of kickboxing means she's an up-close brawler with limited reach, but has the highest speed and agility. Generally, in beat-em-ups for some reason, female characters are usually always faster than their male counterparts. Even though I don't see any reason why the likes of Blaze Fielding, for example, would be faster than the likes of Adam and Axel. They look like men in peak condition, so I would have thought that biology would be on their side. They should have just made Blaze the weakest and the hard mode of the game. It would have been more realistic that way. But hey, don't look at me, I don't make the rules. Not every woman in gaming can be a brick shit house like Marissa, the muscle mummy all of you at home regularly fantasize about. Ooh. With 3 characters available at the start of the game, this means that players can truly engage in 3-person co-op without repeating any designs, and players can even toggle friendly fire. So if you want a bit more of a challenge, you can simply throw enemies at your friends, punishing them whenever they disobey you. In terms of control, simplicity is key in this game. There are just 3 buttons to remember, one for attacking, another for jumping, and a third for executing special techniques. But once you begin exploring the game's combat, you will quickly discover that it offers way more depth than one would expect. In addition to the basic controls, we also have access to various grappling techniques. We can launch our enemies in different directions while executing combos. The effectiveness of our attacks even changes when we perform them while running. Defensively, it is also possible to employ a stop system to defend oneself. This requires precise timing, pressing either forward or backward at the exact moment you anticipate an incoming attack, allowing it to be countered effectively. Furthermore, the game features specific commands using the directional pad and buttons to execute unique attacks. All the elements we have mentioned so far can be combined to create an array of diverse and intricate combinations to pull off devastating maneuvers. Even walls can be utilised to bounce opponents from, thus extending the potential injuries we can inflict upon them. Nice. Special attacks are crucial in battle, granting us frames of invulnerability and inflicting significant damage. Safeguards are in place though, preventing us from simply spamming such functions. This is partially done via a rechargeable indicator to make us more selective regarding when we choose to unleash hell. But if this meter happens to not be filled, you can perform these explosive attacks in exchange for a portion of one's life bar instead. The defensive mechanic that we mentioned earlier is also important, as parrying helps us replenish that incredibly useful special attack bar. Throughout a playthrough, the action unfolds at a remarkable pace and the combat encounters are fluid, thus enabling us to continuously chain together powerful strikes. Consequently, boredom is often the last thing on one's mind when playing this game. Everything about Fight and Rage has a fantastic rhythm to it, making combat feel incredibly satisfying throughout. Everything one could want from a beat 'em up really. One thing I would like to add though, at points this game feels freaking hard, particularly when facing off against the final boss. To some degree it has that get good or go home mentality instilled within it, an old school attitude that is severely lacking with most modern video games. Not only is this challenge refreshing and welcomed, But you get that sweet dopamine release from managing to do something difficult, which you're never ever gonna get in a basic bitch game like, say, The Last of Us 2 for example. This is a real game, not modern interactive movie nonsense. If you have failed enough times on your quest and are playing multiplayer and blame your cohorts for your shortcomings, you can take the battle to versus mode. A versus mode in any fighting game would be a bit boring if you could only play as 3 street ruffians, as the original Fatal Fury would quickly find out. But thanks to the variety of villains you defeat in your quest, you can recruit over 20 of your foes for the versus mode. Throughout the game, players will earn a number of coins that can be redeemed in the menu. Thankfully, accurately remembering how games were handled back in the day, there's no paid DLC to unlock new characters, you just have to grind the in-game currency. Beyond new characters for the versus mode, you can unlock new costumes for the characters, a variety of difficulty settings and speeds. This inclusion within the game helps give it a great deal of replayability, providing plenty of reason to come back to this well-designed game. But don't just take my word regarding this game's greatness, let's hear what others had to say too. The publication known as Vandal would love the game, stating, "We're not going to beat around the bush. Fight and Rage is one of the best classic beat-em-ups ever made. A true tribute for fans of the genre who should not let it escape for the world. It has a multitude of routes, endings, modes, secrets, extras, and a great audio-visual section and bomb-proof gameplay. Ingredients that combine to leave us with a product that is as challenging as it is satisfying, and fun that it is impossible to reject as long as you like it. What it proposes, whether it's to play alone or in company, don't hesitate to give it a try. You will not regret it." While criticising its short gameplay length, darkzero.co.uk would shower this one with praise too. They would write, "In the end, Fight and Rage can't escape its short runtime, which is prominent with every beat-em-up game. They were originally created to serve as short arcade experiences after all. But the branching story paths, combo-heavy characters, and numerous unlockable extras more than make up a full package filled with incentives to keep playing. As a modern throwback to arcade classics, Fight and Rage is one of the very best in the business right now." F Nintendo added to the praise, commenting, "Fight and Rage has a name that suggests an old school beat 'em up, and that's exactly what it is. A tribute to some of the classic names of this dimension of gaming that was so popular in decades past. But that's not the only thing that Fight and Rage gets right. Its gameplay mechanics, amount of content, different endings, and top-notch audio-visual environment all contribute to make this one classic-style beat-em-up that is worthy to enter the Nintendo Switch of any fan of the style. Beyond the game's initial release on consoles, digital marketplaces, this would not be the end of Fight and Rage Mania. You will be happy to know that the PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch releases would gain physical releases thanks to Limited Run, with the high-end version of the game being bundled with a soundtrack. This soundtrack was masterfully created by Gonzalo Varela and is also available digitally on the Steam marketplace with the game. Coming later this year, there will also be another new physical release by Spanish-published Selecta Play, including a diorama and a gold edition of the album in a remastered 2-disc collection. Following the previous physical releases, the developers would go back to the title and make a fair amount of upgrades for the next generation of consoles. For the PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and the Xbox Series S, Blitworks would upgrade the title with 120 frames per second gameplay. So, if you're one of the people who can count that crazy amount of frames per second, your eyes would be amazed at how smooth the sprite-based gameplay would be. Compared to heavy hitters like Streets of Rage 4 and Shredder's Revenge, Fight and Rage has flown a bit under the radar versus the others. But for many who have experienced this game, it is a cherished title in its own right. Overall, Fight and Rage is an enjoyable homage to beat-em-ups of old. It successfully captures the spirit of classic arcade games, offering a nostalgic experience with its retro visuals and engaging gameplay. If you're a fan of old school brawlers and appreciate challenging gameplay, Fight and Rage is definitely worth checking out. The 2016 game would be created by a French studio known as Reptiles, a studio that would be partly formed by a game designer known as Frédéric Croisbeau, who left his job working at Ubisoft Paris. The game would be directed by former web designer Alexandre Moutonnet, with music from an artist known as Florian Renel. In 2014, the first teaser for the game would show off the BDSM nightclub stage, which the team state was heavily inspired by Hotline Miami. Footage of this would quickly spread around the world, building excitement around the game even prior to its release. At E3 2015, the game would be officially announced and would eventually see release for PlayStation 4, PC and later even the Nintendo Switch, meaning there are a number of ways that you can play this high quality affair. Mother Russia Bleeds is set in an alternative 1980s Soviet Union, ruled by a government who are funded and manipulated by the Russian mafia. In this 4-player beat-em-up, you take control of one of 4 Ruska Romani people, named Sergei, Natasha, Ivan and Boris. At the beginning of the game's plot, the foursome work for a man named Mikhail, a man who makes a living by organising street fights in the Russian slums. In fact, gamers get the opportunity to get to grips with the mechanics early on, as you take on wave after wave of low-level opponents in an arena as locals cheer on the violence. The fun is spoiled though pretty swiftly as government forces wearing bulletproof armour and carrying shields surround the player character and brutalise them until they fall completely unconscious. When the character, or characters if you're playing cooperatively, awaken, the first proper stage in the game begins. After gaining consciousness, it quickly becomes clear that the Romani have been thrown into a government-owned laboratory, with staff members revealing to the playable characters that they are being used as guinea pigs for a concoction of a highly addictive injectable substance known as Necro. Enraged by what has happened, the character you control wants to take revenge on who has done this to them, meaning the first stage consists of making your way through the lab and killing any security and scientists that stand in your way. Before we talk more about this disturbing adventure, let's touch on the mechanics. In terms of the fighting itself, we get to utilise a lot of standard beat 'em up manoeuvres, jumps, punches, kicks, and combining buttons allows for very simplistic combos. The most notable departure from the norm though relates to the fact that you control a character who has become dependent on drugs. This means that they regularly experience intense hallucinations that at points can allow them to fight through injuries and give them monstrous strength. In regards to this, players have access to a syringe, which they can have their character inject into themselves to refill their health bar or enter a berserk state. Interestingly, when you knock certain opponents down on the floor, they will enter a convulsive state. During these instances, you can use your syringe to extract Necro from them to inject into your own character. This interesting yet disturbing mechanic leads to some novel gameplay, whereby when your character's life bar is nearly depleted, you find yourself desperate to locate your next fix. Pretty immersive stuff really. The game has melee weapons aplenty, which are extremely satisfying to use, with guns, grenades and ammunition to access too, resulting in a beat 'em up which feels far more destructive than most. You really do feel like you are playing in a war zone in this one. Throughout the stages, there is plenty of character dialogue to push the story along, and each of the 8 main stages have their own boss fights, all of which require their own unique strategies to overcome, with a reliance on regular combat being a quick route to the grave. When players reach the second stage, which is located above ground, it is soon learned that they are inside a prison, whereby fellow inmates and later guards must be dispatched of. Backgrounds are detailed with often plenty of stuff going on, helping to further immerse gamers into the game's animated world. When a riot breaks out, for example, the sirens, fires, falling projectiles and blunt objects carried by the enemies all add to the feeling of utter chaos. Taking on the lead guard at the end of a stage also results in an exciting encounter whereby you have to aim with a gun and you must line up your shots just right before he shoots you first. This game is intense at times indeed. Stage 3 sees the character head back to the source, where they were captured by the government to begin with. A search for Mikhail begins, who your character holds responsible for the kidnapping and drugging taking place. Here the scale of the drug problem becomes more apparent, as you take on Gopniks and Necroheads, male and female alike, even going as far as to take out opponents who are indulging in an illegal drug-fueled rave. The constant air raid sirens, convulsing screens, pace-changing music all add to this game's erraticness and the illusion of hallucinations. It would be an understatement to refer to this murky game as a bit trippy. The whole thing is so dystopian and bloody weird. Stage 3 ends with a boss fight against a gang leader who can satisfyingly be defeated by using a weapon to knock them into a moving vehicle that features spinning chainsaws. The more I played this game, the more I enjoyed it. The tempo is great and every boss battle is drastically different from the next. Moving on to stage 4, you meet up with an NPC who you encounter at the beginning of the game, known as Vladimir, who is heading with a group of other citizens to the city. Vlad is a militant communist who leads a group of revolutionary rebels who assist the player throughout the action of the game. This Che Guevara wannabe features heavily in this 4th stage, whereby he and the group of rebels hijack the train, leading the fights with guards and ultimately against a government official officer. This is an interesting boss fight as both the player and the enemy must avoid oncoming trains, as well as utilising Vlad's flash grenades against the opponent. Defeating this foe is as satisfying as the rest. In the continued hunt for Mikhail, players head to the game's infamous BDSM club stage, where all sorts of freaky goings on are taking place. At one amusing point during this stage, a friendly gimp even decides to submit to the player, making the decision to help fight on your behalf. This is perhaps the strangest and most surreal stage in the game as of yet, and feels more Streets of Rage Russia-like than ever before. Eventually, Mikhail is tracked down, who admits he had no choice but to team with the Mafia and the authorities to hand before Romany over for experiments. He is overall disappointed that the player character or characters have come, because now they are going to be murdered. After this, a huge boss battle takes place against a massive BDSM monster, who if players can evade his attacks, he takes out the gimps along the side of the screen instead, thus meaning you have time to attack him. After that ridiculously strange stage, the stick stage, known as the Revolution, features exactly what the level's name implies and sees the player brawling through the streets of Russia, taking out the army, government officials and secret police along the way. At one point in this epic stage, you meet Vlad and his rebel forces, who join the protagonist to take part in this epic civil war. Vladimir reveals that the Russian government have completely lost the plot, and everything has gone to hell in the country. According to Vlad, the government even went as far as to use brutality to stop the protest marches in their tracks. Still, in this time of crisis, Vlad quips that his country does not have security forces, only insecurity forces, so it's time to storm the government's headquarters, as Vlad predicts that the Russian government are about to attempt to commit a mass genocide, so they must be stopped to save the civilian population. After witnessing soldiers showing up and starting to beat the civilian population who were protesting, Vlad said you can't imagine the things the group of rebels saw. It was sickening. He reports that this has been enough to push the public over the edge, and downtown has become a battleground between the Russian government and the Russian people. You make your way through the stage, repelling government forces throughout, even gaining the opportunity to wield Kalashnikovs against them. At one point in the stage, you also get to team with a bunch of rebels as you take out riot police, throwing grenades, Molotov cocktails and other homemade explosives, as you try all that you can to stop their march towards you. The stage boss fight takes place against a government official controlling a militarised vehicle, who once defeated allows gamers to move on to stage 7. Here our protagonists enter the underground car park of the government HQ, but it soon transpires that they have been lured into a trap, and an all-out fight takes place. I mean, what else are you going to do within a beat 'em up anyway? Finally, escaping the car park and reaching the outside of the underground entrance of the main building, players bump into Mikhail once more. He reveals that his arm has been chopped off as a result of the playable character standing up to the authorities. Mikhail is furious that the protagonist killed soldiers and police officers, and proclaims that he is an idiot for coming here to cross swords with who are essentially mob bosses running the country. Mikhail begs the player character not to make things worse, but they refuse, so Mikhail lets the protagonist into the government building anyway. Players then quickly find themselves in a Soviet Coliseum, where a crowd of jeering mobsters and oligarchs excitedly encourage the competitors to inflict violence against one another. If you keep poking away and not laying down for defeat, eventually a Russian bear comes out to kill you. Being a frickin' bear, this is of course a tough opponent, but provided you attack it from the right angles, victory is achieved and the bear is declawed. After the win, Mikhail reappears, who is sickened by the carnage, but the player character is happy with their decision, stating you can't bow down to lunatics like them. On the way to confronting them, Mikhail states that you can't imagine what they will do to us if we get caught, so proceeds to shoot himself in the head so he doesn't have to be a part of it anymore. The next section of the game is classic beat 'em up stuff, as the final stage consists of wave after wave of enemies who must be defeated within the ornate beautiful halls of the Last Keep. If you have played games like Streets of Rage and Final Fight, the setting will be very familiar. Hallucinations through this section begin to become stronger and stronger as the player's trips become worse and worse from the effects of their drug addiction. There is a cool part of the stage where you have to avoid a helicopter from shooting you through the building's windows, a shark room with a shark tank, lewd images of the nation's leader hanging on the walls, and more. It's all very dystopian and gets stranger by the moment. After a long and grueling stage through bedrooms and more corridors, eventually you manage to corner the nation's leader in his office. The leader tries to worm his way out of a situation, claiming he did not know the damage that the drug could do, and he just thought it was no more than a synthetic chemical he wanted to sell for national profits, claiming he is no mobster and just a politician. The protagonist says that he is going to take him out, as Vladimir said defeating him will make the whole house of cards fall down. The politician hides under the table and repeatedly calls for backup. This boss fight sees him keep trying to escape via a ladder released from a helicopter. The goal is to keep knocking him off while surviving the waves until he is eventually defeated. As usual, this is a very unique boss encounter. Eventually, the politician agrees to find common ground with the protagonist, but the drug addict at this point begins his most intense trip as of yet. Here, the beat 'em up equivalent of what I can only describe as the ending to the likes of Earthbound or Undertale takes place, where it appears that the protagonist must battle with his own addiction and inner turmoil. After the true final boss fight, a different ending occurs to the game, based on what choices the player makes within this psychedelic encounter. In both endings, when the trip concludes, it transpires that the player has massacred Russia's leader, with the security forces laying down their arms and siding with the Russian people. However, if you rely on the drug to get you through the final battle, the protagonist never wakes up from their trip. Vlad does reappear though and says he will mourn their death and remember their heroics. If drugs are not used in the final fight and the protagonist survives the trip, Vlad promises to get the hero to the hospital to flush the necro out of their system. The last scene of the game reveals that Vlad and his rebels have built a statue in the hero's honour, stating that no one has to know or care what methods he used to achieve victory, stating that all champions throughout history have bloodied hands anyway. All that matters is that they represented the downtrodden. This sees the hero admitting that they will become part of Vlad's history, even though they admit multiple times earlier in the plot that they only wanted to take out the government for personal revenge, rather than any actual motivation for the greater good, resulting in an ending designed to make gamers think and ask themselves more questions. The game would receive mixed reviews on the whole from critics, with GameSpot writing, "It may appear to be a simple brawler with retro art reminiscent of the beat 'em up Golden Age, but it goes much deeper. It alleviates the monotony of some of the best brawlers. It introduces wrinkles that make each level feel fresh, and it weaves complex themes into its gameplay in ways that, although not subtle, are nuanced. Mother Russia Bleeds knows how to upset many expectations of the genre. I just wish it wasn't always trying to shock me." Eurogamer would be much harsher with their analysis, concluding that the familiarity and expectedness of pixel ultra-violence has been robbed of its ability to outrage. Beyond that, this is a game that has simply swapped one set of cliches, the US-centric mean streets of Final Fight and Streets of Rage, for another, Soviet brutality and poverty. There is undeniably sport to be had there, but no redemption either for the characters, the players or the genre. PC Game would be even more dismissive of the title, writing that it perhaps says something about our collective desensitization to interactive violence, that a game in which you can uppercut a pimp's head from his torso and then use it to bludgeon a scrawny drug addict to death isn't really doing much we haven't seen before. A depressing thought at the end of this grisly little game. When the game made it over to the Nintendo Switch, Nintendo Life in 2018 would only give the game 5 out of 10 stars, writing, Mother Russia Bleeds is a proficiently made side-scrolling beat-em-up that ultimately fails to drag this already limited genre forward with any great new ideas of its own. Add in a wearingly mature aesthetic and you're left with an oddly downbeat button-mashing action game. Fans of the genre should wait for the forthcoming Streets of Rage 4 or download Capcom's superb beat-em-up bundle. Okay, so in regards to these varied reviews, I can't say that playing it myself that violence was the main thing that I took from the experience, but rather an expertly made beat-em-up that is up there with the likes of Streets of Rage 4 and River City Girls, that simultaneously attempts to address a lot of sensitive topics that you rarely see addressed in video games. To consider Mother Russia Bleeds no more than a mindless beat-em-up is really doing this one a disservice. I personally loved this game and felt the music, style and aesthetics were different from any game in the genre I've ever played before. Maybe it is the current political climate the world is in today, but I certainly don't feel this is in any way a cookie cutter video game like many journalists judged it to be. People have been recommending me play this game well before the recent invasion of Ukraine. Like Double Dragon Neon for me, this is one of those beat-em-ups with enough character and just the right amount of tempo to keep me coming back time and time again. And maybe even perhaps my favourite game I've played in 2022 so far. This beat-em-up is that good in my opinion, so I would love to hear your thoughts on this edgy game down below in the comment section. 2012, the year of the London Olympics, the Arab Spring, and a terrible movie about the end of the world. The period is well known for many things, but one of them certainly isn't beat-em-ups. In fact, game journalist of IGN, Mitch Dyer, would do an epic job of showing to us just how much the mainstream gaming media at the time seemed to loathe the genre. Not only burying Double Dragon Neon in his review of the game that year, but in the process burying the entire genre as a whole. In his scathing piece he would write, "Let's address a sad truth nobody wants to hear. The brawler genre is not very good anymore. The beat-em-up was built on the back of arcade game design. Difficulty didn't come by design, but by consequence of clunky mechanics meant to scam kids out of more quarters." Regarding the genre, he would add, "It is afraid to let go of the 80s altar it worships at, even if it means cramming a crummy, archaic experience down players' throats." Mitch Dyer, along with many other gaming journalists, had written off an entire genre as old, dated garbage that would never make a comeback. But fast forward a decade later, and it becomes clear that this ignorant write-up could not have been more wrong. While Mitch would move on to writing plots for dubious Star Wars games on behalf of EA, the beat-em-up genre would go from strength to strength, delivering to us classic after classic, with Streets of Rage 4 sitting atop the mountain as arguably the best of the whole bunch. This is of course debatably until we got Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge, a game that has proved once and for all that beat-em-ups are popular and mainstream again. What is interesting though about this Turtles game is that it has clearly been inspired by the Turtles arcade classics. But at the same time, the game's heritage is just as much rooted in the 21st century as it is linked to the arcade hits. And it also goes a hell of a long way in explaining this game's high pedigree. To grasp this further, all we need to do is look at the development studio behind the title, known as Tribute Games, who are based out in Montreal, Canada. Back in 2007, key staff members from Tribute Games worked at Ubisoft Montreal, with them developing a criminally underrated Turtles beat-em-up for Nintendo's Game Boy Advance hardware. This hidden gem was by far the greatest Ninja Turtles video game since the franchise's arcade days, delivering a fun and addictive brawler in an era in which the genre was practically dead. Most who have played this game though, including myself, describe a high caliber experience that certainly deserves some extra attention. However, this would not be the only brawler from Ubisoft Montreal, as fast forward another 3 years, we would get the surprisingly brilliant Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. This shockingly good video game, based on the now cult favourite movie of the same name, was a brilliantly fun effort, offering up the best beat-em-up that the world had seen in many years. Not bad at all for a digital only game made for Xbox Live and the PlayStation Network. but it tells you all you need to know about the level of respect that the genre was getting at the time. Even the very best games were receiving little in the way of a marketing push or fanfare. Since it was a digital only game, fast forward to December the 30th 2014, the game would be delisted from digital stores. But fortunately, this would not be the last we would see of this one. Fans would beg for years to see this video game brought back, which is exactly what would happen 7 years later in 2021, 11 years after the game's initial release. Not only was the game made readily available across all modern digital storefronts, but even physical versions of the game were manufactured this time around. With games like this, Streets of Rage 4, River City Girls and Fighting Rage being on the market simultaneously, it was clear the beat-em-up renaissance period was here. And with games like Final Vendetta and River City Girls 2 on the horizon, it has looked like things would only get better. Speaking of this new golden age for the arcade-style brawler, publishers of Streets of Rage 4, Dotemu, would shock the world once more, when on March 10th, 2021, they would drop a trailer for another beat-em-up that had previously only seemed like the stuff of dreams. The magical trailer would blare out a remixed version of the classic Ninja Turtles theme tune, laid over the top of some awesome animated visuals reminiscent of the 80s American cartoon favourite. The best though was yet to come, as gameplay was quickly revealed of an all-new beat-em-up based on the arcade originals. This video would display that the game would be able to be played with at least 4-player cooperative play, and the title, full of beautiful sprite work, was being developed by none other than Tribute Games, the Montreal development studio where key staff members work, who not only brought to us Scott Pilgrim, but of course the previous decent Turtles brawler. The combination of these guys working with Dotemu, the Streets of Rage 4 publishers, made me feel like we were in very safe hands indeed. But of course, the game now had a hell of a lot of hype to live up to. As great as this game looked from the trailers, everyone was more than aware that delivering a game of the same calibre as Turtles Arcade and Turtles in Time would be a tall order indeed, but staff at Tribute Games would toil away to try and make this dream a reality. Development would progress and Dotemu would reveal more and more about the game on their YouTube channel page. But some of the coolest info on the game would begin to be published on April 13th, 2022, with the publisher releasing videos documenting the development process. Jean-Francois Major, the technical director of Tribute Games, would sit down for a coffee with Dotemu executive producer Cyrille Imbert, where they would discuss the project's inception. Major notes that he grew up with the franchise and dressed up as Donatello for Halloween as a child, with the Turtles forever being present in his life since. Imbert states that after finding success working on Streets of Rage 4, his company were keen to publish another huge beat-em-up and would open discussions with Nickelodeon about the possibility of making a new Turtles game. It would be here that Imbert and company would learn that another company had pitched to them the same idea, which was of course Tribute Games, resulting in the two companies deciding that this was the perfect opportunity to team up and clean shell. They also raise that with the boom in popularity of retro gaming and nostalgia in general, that the bringing back of the 1987 Turtles seemed like a lucrative move that would make sense. The fully animated trailer, with the theme from the original show featuring gameplay full of stunning pixel art, was exactly what gamers and long-time Turtles fans were hungry for. In a further upload to the Dotemu channel, we also got to learn more about the games from Frederick Gemus, Shredder's Revenge's designer, who brings up that he used to harass his parents to allow him to play the Turtles at the arcades. The game's director, Jonathan Levine, who also worked on the 2007 GBA game, brings up the core fun factors with the new game will be the tone, the upbeatness and all of the crazy characters of the series. That, when paired with the game's multiplayer aspect, will deliver a pick up and play experience that is perfect to enjoy with friends and family. He also mentions that he went back and played all of the old games at the start of the production, noting that with the classic arcade games that the pacing is so fast they play almost like shoot 'em ups, with enemies entering the screen in patterns, with players having to get into a rhythm to beat the stages. it was key to include this sort of pacing if they wanted a game that felt like the best Turtles of yesteryear. Stages would be designed like episodes, with the DNA of the game being reminiscent of the classic 80s cartoon. Cameos would also add that a story mode and arcade mode would both be included so that old school gamers could play the game like those from the old days, or players could opt for a more casual experience, with stages over a world map featuring challenges and more. How super easy the game was to jump in and out of was an essential ingredient that the developers wanted in Shredder's Revenge. They would also bring up how exciting it was to be introducing April and Master Splinter to the game, to not only bring in playable characters who were different from the Turtles, but also because the characters have been hanging out with the heroic foursome for so long. In terms of the rest of the game's cast, Cameos mentions that he wanted the game to include as large a scope of different characters together as possible, drawing comparisons with a 90s kid playing with all of their Turtles action figures simultaneously. Also mentioning that the game would be littered with cameos and Easter eggs that old school fans would appreciate. Cameos would describe what they worked on as the ultimate arcade beat 'em up game. Its gameplay is fast and all about ploughing through hordes of foot soldiers, focusing more on crowd control and getting rid of enemies quickly, rather than focusing on technical one-on-one combat like the wonderful Streets of Rage 4. Adam Marin, the game's art director, adds that from the beginning the art team's goal was simple, but lofty. We wanted to give Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles fans a chance to relive the series' classic 80s beat-em-up action, with a greater than ever sense of personality felt in each individual asset. To get there, they drew on decades of classic continuity, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comics, films and cartoons. Justin Sear, the animation supervisor for the game, adds that since the 1987 incarnation of the show is so distinct, it has involved him going back a lot over the old shows and the old games. There's been a lot of research involved looking at what makes each character distinct and coming up with animations that reflected that. Running cycles, for example, were different to match each character, reflecting their unique quirks. Yannick Belziz, the game's scriptwriter, mentions that he went back and watched old episodes for the project too, for character-specific and environment-specific info. The game's composer, T. Lopez, brings up that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was the first Saturday morning cartoon that he can remember watching, and never imagined making music for such a game. He would create music for the game inspired by music from the classic show, such as the track reminiscent of Channel 6's theme, for example, that would help throw the player into that environment on the game's opening stage. When composing the game's tracks, Lopez states that with a game like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, he felt it needed kick-ass beats for the action factor, but also for old instruments that were used back in the day that people will recognise from those times. Lopez was so thorough in his approach that he would obtain sounds from the same sources as the composers from years ago, researching old video games, movies, for TV series, all absorbing information from a variety of sources. He describes that transcribing the Turtles into music had a lot to do with the music's attitude, reflecting what was going on screen, often creating tracks that old school fans were going to identify with. So, after a 2-year development cycle and a lot of love, respect and hard work being pumped into the game by a passionate and driven team, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge is at last finally here. In Dotamu's own words, the company describes this gem as being a video game that features modernised gameplay rooted in timeless classic brawling mechanics. They pitch Turtles as a video game whereby players must bash their way through gorgeous pixel art environments and slay tons of hellacious enemies while using their favourite Ninja Turtle. Each character has their own skills and moves, making a run with each unique. Players can pick a fighter, use radical combos to defeat their opponents, and experience intense combat loaded with breathtaking action and outrageous ninja abilities. You can grab your best friend and play with multiple simultaneously. Powering the game on for the first time, gamers will be dazzled by the startup animation first seen in the game's trailer, featuring the original Turtles theme, which is enough to get any player's blood flowing. Now, we mentioned earlier that the game contains both an arcade and story mode, with there being cutscenes present that help push the game's narrative along. As for this game's story, it starts out with Bebop and Rocksteady assaulting Channel 6 and stealing super gnarly devices to support Krang and Shredder's latest twisted plan. Throughout this adventure, the Turtles battle across a righteous range of timeless locations from the franchise that help make the experience feel all the more authentic, from Manhattan and Coney Island to city rooftops and dank sewers. There was an assortment of varied themed stages to get through, trouncing foot soldiers, triceratons and rock troops all along the way. Playing through this game myself, one of the main things I took from it is what a huge beat 'em up this is, with the title offering up a massive experience featuring a total of a whopping 16 different stages. In fact, I'm pretty sure that this is the longest arcade style beat 'em up I have ever played through, with this unique brawler offering up an insane amount of variety from its stages to all of the crazy different bosses to take out. This mind-blowing nostalgia fest essentially brings along old school gameplay that has been enhanced through the use of its super fresh mechanics. This is emphasised through the game's brawling mechanics that have plenty in common with the games of old, but brings plenty of new elements to the table too. What I mean by this is that you can perform classic moves such as the jumping diving kick, or perform the iconic manoeuvre of picking up an opponent, then comically hurling them towards your viewing monitor. It is touches like this that help make the game feel in tune with the greatness that came before it. But to be fair, not only do the Turtles have richer general movesets than what came before, with manoeuvres that are unique to each in-game character, but the game also introduces what is essentially a combo meter, with fighters able to build it up by performing combos against opponents. Once this is filled up, the selectable characters can perform huge satisfying attacks that can do a lot of damage to a lot of enemies at once, which I must say is not only a hell of a lot of fun to do, but it also further emphasises how quick gameplay in this one can be. There is a lot of moves to gain experience with, and in story mode you can level up to unlock new super attacks, gain additional life and extend the ninja power bar. Combat wise, this is by far the deepest Turtles brawler yet, and that is without even mentioning the varied double teams that are possible and the ability to give health to a co-op partner. There are many layers to the beat 'em up action in this expertly crafted future classic. It's not just the fighting in this one that is top notch though, but also of course the graphics. Now we have already gone through some of the lengths that the development team went through to make this game the most pleasurable experience possible, and the title's gorgeous pixel renders are yet another reason to love this lunacy. The game's signature locales in this one are brimming with detail, and constant callbacks to the show and video games of yesteryear are present. There is so much I could talk about with regards to this element of the game, however I feel video clips I've used throughout can get away with doing the talking for me. As you can see, the game is stunning and is chock full of carefully drawn characters that ooze personality and charm. With regards to the characters, one of my favourite things about the game is of course the many memorable boss battles, particularly in the later portions of the game where I was forced to think on my feet a little more. Each of these opponents requires a different strategy to defeat, with some of these processes becoming more complex as we progress through the game. The final throws was definitely my favourite portion, with boss battles not only being inventive but somehow often being nostalgic simultaneously. Take this fight with Chrome Dome for example, where he at points punches you from afar as you fight him from his first person perspective. This boss design is reminiscent of a Shredder battle in the Super Nintendo version of Turtles in Time. I must say the boss fight against the Statue of Tyranny also provides the fun visual and an epic feeling boss encounter, but nothing quite matched up to getting to face off against Super Shredder, an opponent who feels invincible at first until you learn his patterns and strike in his moments of weakness. Destroying Kevin Nash's quads to ensure he would not bother me again was a satisfying experience to say the least. There is only one Big Daddy cool around here, and he wears a top hat. Yeah. The story mode provides some nice additional features, such as additional items to find within stages, and even being able to unlock Casey Jones as the secret 7th playable fighter. A fan favourite of a fighter who fans have been desperate to see as a playable in an official classic arcade-style Turtles game for as long as the character has existed. Shredder's Revenge also marks the first Turtles game of this kind where you have the option to incredibly play the game with up to 6 people cooperatively, both locally and online. An awesome feature that has made this my all-time favourite 6-player beat-em-up, surpassing the memorable X-Men arcade. The whole video game is laced together with a banging original soundtrack, which as mentioned was composed by T. Lopez, which in my opinion fits the theme and feel of the game perfectly. Like much of the rest of this game, it all sounds quite familiar, yet at the same time sounds so fresh. Since beating story mode, I am highly keen to play this game more so that I can continue to take in the atmosphere and complete more of the challenges. I loved everything about this game and I feel it built on the likes of Turtles in Time and Turtles Arcade perfectly, presenting a modern experience that still has plenty of callbacks that remind us of a time that makes us all feel warm and fuzzy. But these are just the opinions of one man, me. So rather than just take my word for it, let's hear what the mainstream gaming media had to say. IGN, the company who had a journalist write off beat-em-ups completely 10 years ago, would summarise, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge is exactly what it looks like. A lovingly crafted reimagining of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade beat-em-ups from one of the best beat-em-up developers in the business today. It's the perfect game to have in the library for when a group of friends come over and you want to play something that's simple, fun, and can be comfortably finished in a single sitting. Destructoid would add, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge is a delightful celebration of the heroes in a hard shell. More importantly, it's simply a hell of a lot of fun to play. For anyone who ever jumped off of a schoolyard wall, tree branch in hand shouting "Cowabunga," Shredder's Revenge is absolutely worth shelling out for. GameSpot would write the game is a tremendous labour of love that lives up to the legacy of Turtles in Time and the brawlers that came before it. Combat is fast paced and simple yet satisfying, while new features help modernise the action without tampering with its 16-bit essence. Rehashing a classic retro game is always a tough ask, but Shredder's Revenge avoids the obvious pitfalls and successfully brings about the revival of everyone's favourite Mutant Turtles.
The game, with its high quality on release, would receive unanimous praise across the board, but a few years removed from all of this, there are now more reasons to love this epic title than ever. On August 31st, 2023, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge's Dimension Shellshock DLC would see release, an additional wave of content that made this already excellent game even better. Dimension Shellshock is an exciting DLC expansion that builds on the foundation of Shredder's Revenge by introducing a range of new features and content. In doing so, it enriches the experience with fresh characters, a novel survival mode, and various customization options, making it an attractive addition for fans of the series. One of the most notable features of Dimension Shellshock DLC was the introduction of 2 new playable characters. These include Usagi Yojimbo, the iconic samurai rabbit from the Usagi Yojimbo comics, who makes his debut bringing his distinct sword fighting skills and martial prowess to the game. His combat style is both fluid and powerful, making him a unique addition to the roster. Then we have Karai, a character deeply rooted in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles lore, with ties to the Foot Clan. Known for her agility and electrifying attacks, she adds a dynamic new fighting style to the lineup. These characters expand the game's already rich combat diversity, providing even more exciting options to us players, and plenty of fresh techniques and combos to master. Building on this, as mentioned, the DLC's survival mode offers a twist on the traditional beat-em-up formula. In this mode, players can travel across various dimensions, each with their own distinct enemies, challenges, and visual themes. As players progress, they collect crystals that enable them to shift between these dimensions, keeping the gameplay engaging and unpredictable. This dimension hopping mechanic introduces a sense of variety. As players survive increasingly difficult waves of enemies, they can unlock permanent upgrades, power-ups, new moves, and different colour schemes for characters, creating a satisfying sense of progression that keeps the mode compelling and rewarding. What's more is that in addition to the new gameplay modes, the DLC features new music and visuals that enhance the overall experience. The fresh tracks maintain the retro aesthetic that Shredder's Revenge is known for, while introducing energetic and thematic music that complements the dimension hopping adventures.
This variety in visuals helped to keep the game feeling fresh, even for players who have spent countless hours with the base game, or perhaps years at this point. Thankfully, the DLC maintains the game's strong multiplayer experience, ensuring that all new content can be enjoyed with friends both locally and online. This feature is particularly important as it allows players to tackle the challenges of survival mode together, making the dimension hopping experience more engaging and more cooperative. While this stood out as a significant expansion, at the September 2024 PlayStation State of Play event, even more DLC was announced for the game, making Shredder's Revenge even richer. As outlined by the PlayStation blog, the Radical Reptiles DLC introduces 2 new characters, Mona Lisa and Mondo Gecko. Mona Lisa, a once human scientist turned mutant salamander, brings her cheery attitude to battle against the Foot Clan, and Mondo Gecko, the coolest cement surfing mutant, joins forces in this action-packed DLC. They outline that Mona boasts a unique fling slam, super flying kick and multiple projectile attacks with special braking animations, making her a beginner-friendly ranged character. Her science background is expressed through her chemistry equipment, and fun details like her 90s toy blowfish mace are included to delight fans. They add that Mona Lisa's design process was more relaxed and natural compared to Mondo, thanks to her naturally flowing shapes and graceful movements. Her design emphasises her playful yet fierce combat style. Mona's projectile-based attacks offer a fresh gameplay experience, making her stand out in melee situations, especially in multiplayer sessions. As for Mondo Gecko, they note that he is known for his laid-back attitude and legendary skateboarding tricks. Mondo's design and development was a challenge for the devs at Tribute. Integrating his skateboard into various animations, including attacks and being hit, posed significant technical challenges. Mondo's aerial acrobatics and bounce attacks make him a dynamic and highly effective fighter. His super attacks are spectacular, with the ground version featuring pyrotechnic effects and breakdancing moves, while the air version delivers a powerful single hit with fire thrusters. Inspiration for Mondo's design came from 80s and 90s skateboarding tricks, creating a visually and mechanically engaging character. The developers ensured his animations and moveset addressed players' feedback on air control, making him a fun and satisfying addition to the roster. On top of yet another 2 characters to players, a free update to the game adds a new remix of the original soundtrack, broadening the appeal of this already legendary beat-em-up even further. Through the love and attention to detail that continues to be put in when crafting this game, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge remains beloved by fans for its nostalgic yet fresh take on the classic beat-em-up genre, capturing the essence of a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade roots. It offers vibrant pixel art, smooth animations, and a dynamic soundtrack that perfectly encapsulate the spirit of the original 1980s cartoon. It balances retro-inspired gameplay with modern mechanics perfectly, making it accessible to both long-time fans and newcomers, all while paying homage to the beloved franchise's history with its multiple DLC updates, with this one just keeping on getting better and better. To fully understand the significance of River City Girls, there is a lot of history to digest, much of which we have already covered in my River City Ransom video previously. River City Ransom, known as Street Gangs in Europe, is actually the 3rd game in a series of titles that went under a completely different name in Japan, Kunio-kun. The first game in the Kunio series, known as Neketsu Koha Kunio-kun, released in 1986, and sees a high school delinquent named Kunio stand up against a series of rival gangs who are frequently targeting his classmate Hiroshi. The game was de-Japanified and released as Renegade in the West, and would establish several of the beat-em-up tropes that we now all know and love. The genius behind this game at Technos Japan, known as Yoshihisa Kishimoto, would pretty much single-handedly invent the entire beat-em-up genre, as everything in beat-em-ups that was not established in Kunio-kun in 1986 would certainly be established in his next game, Double Dragon, in 1987, including beloved cooperative play. The Kunio-kun universe would be expanded in 1987 with Neketsu Koko Dodgeball Boo, a title released as Super Dodgeball in the West, a dodgeball-themed game featuring Kunio and company. In fact, over the years, these characters would feature in plenty more sports games too, but that's a subject for another time. As for the 3rd game, released in 1989, Downtown Neketsu Story, as mentioned, would become River City Ransom. and like all other games from the series would undergo great changes in its storyline and graphical presentation during its localization, in order to make the game more palatable to the Western market. After the release of this beloved game, over the years there would be countless more Kunio-kun titles released, many of which were more sports games, remakes and compilations of previous games. Still though, there were multiple brand new beat-em-up RPGs released as well, many of which remained exclusive to Japan. As mentioned in my Double Dragon videos many times before, the IP holders of both Kunio-kun and Double Dragon, known as Technos Japan, would declare bankruptcy in the mid-90s, with Japanese company Arc System Works now holding the licenses for both franchises. In terms of the game we are looking at today, River City Girls, it was a collaborative effort between Arc System Works and American company Way Forward, the same Way Forward who would have been behind the fantastic Shantae series, and one of my personal favourites, Double Dragon Neon, a game Technos had previously outsourced to them. So Arc Systems must have been happy enough with how they handled the Double Dragon IP to hand them development duties again to create a new River City game. River City Girls turns the River City Ransom narrative on its head by featuring a pair of high school girls known as Misako and Kayako, who must fight their way around the city through enemies and obstacles in order to rescue their boyfriends Kunio and Riki, previous stars of the games. While for Western gamers, planners of these girls may be new, believe it or not, this is not the first game in the series where these two are playable, as prior to this game they starred in Kunio Tachi no Banka, a 1994 Super Famicom game. In this one, Kunio and Riki are convicted of a hit and run, and the pair are imprisoned in a juvenile correction facility. However, the two claim to be innocent. It later transpires that the pair have been framed, so escape from the prison to prove their innocence. In this game, both Misako and Kayako are featured as playable characters, with the duo being able to move faster than the boys. So River City Girls sees this pairing's welcomed return. In terms of the game's development, the title was directed by Adam Tierney and Bannon Rudis, with the goal to take the franchise in an exciting new direction. The goal was to make a game full of characters with unique moves that would accentuate their large personalities. Rudis wanted the combat in the game to be as strong as fighting mechanics found in Arc System Works fighting games, while at the same time minimising the play controls and inputs to make the game have more in common with beat-em-ups of old. A tall task to say the least, but taking into account how satisfying the game feels to play, we cannot claim he did a bad job. Internals at Way Forward would introduce Tierney to the old Kunio Tachi no Banka game, with him instantly falling in love with both Kayako and Misako, the two playable female characters in the title. This would lead to him making the decision to make them two his stars. Pair all this with Megan McDuffie composing the tracks for the stages, cinematics, menus and nearly everything else, and from the start the use of pixel art to connect it to previous games in the Kunio-kun franchise, then all the ingredients were coming together to create something truly special. Now, as already mentioned, the girls are on a quest to rescue their boyfriends, who they suspect have been kidnapped. The game starts out with some great animations depicting a scene with the girls receiving a message on their phone depicting what looks like the boys being taken. This all occurs while the girls are in high school detention, with them breaking out and rampaging across the school, attacking any suspicious people that they come into contact with. Now, for gamers unfamiliar with River City or Kunio-kun games in general, the game follows roughly the same gameplay formula as many others from the series. While many beat-em-ups simply feature side-scrolling stages, River City Girls features a completely different approach, with the game instead being split into 6 areas that need to be played through, with each of these 6 areas essentially being made up of interconnecting tiny stage areas that gamers can go back and forth between. Basically, think of this as like the beat-em-up equivalent of traversing a Metroidvania map. While this may sound fairly complicated, it is more simple and intuitive than it looks on the surface, as gamers progress through these 6 areas in a fairly linear fashion, with story dialogue and icons being placed on the map whenever any backtracking may be necessary. It is all very fun and very easy to follow. Sometimes, to be able to leave certain areas, players must clear certain objectives and win certain battles. In fact, throughout, chain and locks will surround the edges of the screen, indicating that players must defeat a few waves of enemies before they are allowed to progress anywhere further. It is also worth noting that when first starting out in the high school, combat is simple and bare bones, with both of the girls being able to perform simple attacks and perform blocks against oncoming moves. However, the amount of varied attacks that can be performed can be increased, which we shall soon get to. Something else that gamers will quickly notice is that defeating enemies causes them to drop money and experience points. So like in previous Kunio games, the girls can regularly level up to improve their stats as well as use the money to purchase items from the in-game stores. At the end of each of the 6 stage areas there are stage bosses, each of which offer a lot of variety for a game from the beat 'em up genre, which often really mixes up the gameplay. These fights all offer animation cutscenes and really help to push the narrative along, which I must add is a lot more interesting and quirky than what we would usually find from a beat 'em up. The character dialogue is strong throughout, with the game and characters offering enough charm and humour to have you constantly giggling, with the title often showing self-awareness with regards to how ridiculous the concept of a beat 'em up actually is. With the girls even having a conversation with each other, questioning why everyone in their town is so violent, and why they cannot walk a few feet without having to fight someone. Speaking of character dialogue, when encountering Misuzu, the first boss, she wants to stop the pair being able to leave the high school, and acts as a great introduction to the players with regards to how future bosses operate. For those who know their video game history, she is a familiar foe, previously appearing as a tough boss fight in Neketsu Koha Kunio-kun. Gamers will quickly note that her life bar is split into 3 parts, and will also notice that as damage is dealt, her attack patterns change as her meter depletes into each of these 3 parts. This is standard for all bosses in the game, with them getting fiercer as they slowly are backed into a corner by gamers. Conquering Misuzu's attack pattern will result in her spilling more information to the girls and finally allowing them to leave the school, which allows action to spill out onto the streets in true beat 'em up fashion. In this portion of the game, players finally have the opportunity to spend some of that hard-earned cash in typical River City fashion, with the pair being able to splash out on various holdable food items that replenish health, or even head to the dojo to buy new moves. With regards to the dojo, there are 2 placed in the game, the 2 of which are run by none other than the beloved Bimmy and Jimmy themselves, which I must say was a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. The girl's mobile phone acts as a great interface to function as the game's menu system, where the game's map can be accessed to see your location, as well for example to see how to perform the long list of moves that Bimmy and his brother have taught you at the dojo. The moves can obviously be executed against the various enemies that appear in this game. Enemies, I must add, come in 11 different types, each with multiple coloured variations, offering different strength levels. An interesting additional feature of the game is that when the last enemy in an area is beaten to the point that they are stunned, players have the opportunity to spare them and recruit them to use for additional assist attacks. The game's menu keeps track of which characters you have spared, so gamers can set out in order to spare one of each enemy variant if they wish to do so. Around town, players also regularly encounter a character known as Godai, who on multiple occasions pops out of dustbins like the Grouch from Sesame Street. Godai is a strange little man with knowledge of what's happening in River City. He follows Kayoko and Misako around the city and provides them with various quests in each area, which completing rewards them with experience points and additional items, further building on the experiences the game offers. Also in the shopping area, the girls encounter Hiroshi, the very lad from the first ever Kunio game, who was attacked by the gangs who Kunio was looking to avenge. In this game, he is back and helps Kayoko and Misako in Crosstown to get inside its mall. Once the girls have fought their way through the mall, they eventually do battle with another boss on the building's roof. This time they take on Kunio's childhood friend Yamada, who has become a practitioner of the dark arts after a heartbreaking incident. These dark arts appear to grant him telekinetic powers. Yamada was the final boss of downtown Neketsu Monogatari, the game obviously known as River City Ransom itself in the West. The character would reportedly be revised as a cold-blooded evil mastermind with dark powers in River City Rival Showdown, but in River City Girls, his appearance is far more light-hearted, like much of the game and its humour in general. The third act of the game sees our duo brawl their way around the wealthy part of the town, quickly coming up with leads that a fashion designer known as Hibari may know their boyfriend's whereabouts. But after some digging around, they realise that they would need to visit with an offering as a form of payment to get to her. The greatest thing about this whole portion of the game is that when you finally reach the bottom of a department building to get to a mysterious shop to buy the gold cat, you quickly find that the shop is ran by none other than perhaps my all-time favourite beat-em-up video game character, Skullmageddon, with his original voice from Double Dragon Neon making a return too. While it was amazing to see this awesome specimen, I just wish his role could have been even bigger. But it was cool to see him here nonetheless. Who doesn't love Skullmageddon? Hibari offers a very different boss battle to those featured previously, so requires a very different strategy from players to defeat. Her bullet hell attacks and ability to summon minions certainly makes her one of the game's more challenging opponents, but if you can successfully ground her, victory can be won. Players next progress into the slums of the city, where as you would expect, a lot of miscreants lay in wait. The coolest part about this section of the game is certainly the boss battle, as it takes place against one of Double Dragon's most well-known deplorables, a Bobo. Now, a Bobo appearing in Kunio-kun games is nothing new, as he has made cameos in multiple other Kunio games over the years. In this one, the massive brute brags about kidnapping people for money, leading the girls to suspect he is behind Kunio and Ricky's disappearance. A Bobo in the game can use his raw strength in order to make debris fall, which he can use as weapons against the girls. In the same vein though, both Kayako and Misako can use this material against him. Speaking of cameos from other games, they do not simply end with a Bobo, Skullmageddon and Bimmy and Jimmy. In terms of Double Dragon characters, Marion has her own store, and good old ropey Linda is back using her whip as an enemy sprite. In fact, it's not just Kunio and Double Dragon games that River City Girls has callbacks to, but also Combat Tribes, a further beat-em-up created by the legendary Yoshihisa Kishimoto himself. Characters from this game include Belova, who has a store in Crosstown, and Martha Splatterhead, who runs Lucky Pen in Ocean Heights. In fact, Trash is even in this game, the third stage boss of Combat Tribes, who is now appearing as a reappearing enemy who attacks by spinning his hammer or striking down with it. In the game, the girls soon suspect that the boy's disappearance may be in relation to a musician performing a concert in their town, which leads them to Ocean Heights. This leads to another cameo with Double Dragon's Burnoff acting as security, preventing them from entering. After completing the story quest acquiring tickets, hilariously Burnoff dissolves in exactly the same way as he is when he is defeated in the Double Dragon games. The battle against the musician Noise is once again an extremely novel and quirky one, with the boss fight appearing to take a ton of inspiration from Guitar Hero of all things. I bet no one was expecting this reference to be included. Defeating Noise eventually leads players to the final section of the game that sees the girls ascending up a Yakuza tower to take on who they suspect to be Sabu, the Yakuza leader from previous games who surely must have kidnapped their boyfriends. After running a gauntlet against typically tougher opponents in very classic style beat 'em up last stage action, the girls let off a few explosives and they finally find themselves at the top of a tower, where they encounter the Yakuza leader. It transpires though that Sabu is now in prison, and instead his daughter, known as Sabuko, is now running the show, but claims to know absolutely nothing with regards to Kunio and Ricky's whereabouts. This does not stop her wanting to punish the girls though for storming her building and challenging her in the first place. Sabuko functions as this game's final boss with arguably the most varied and challenging attacks as of yet. In fact, when you deplete the 3 chunks of her life bar, she gains an extra 4th one, with her attacks becoming even more ferocious in the process. Sabuko is a martial artist who fights using a katana and elemental ki attacks using various stances. Finally, defeating her brings an end to the playthrough, but what for Ricky and Kunio? After beating Sabuko, Kayako and Misako crash through a window and plummet through the roof of a spa below. Here finally they find Ricky and Kunio, who have simply been relaxing in a sauna the whole time. The boys are surprised and flustered that the girls have dropped in, shielding their modesty in the process. While the boys hide their meat sausages, the girls proclaim how worried they were about them, with Kunio not responding in the way the audience may have expected, and simply complains it's those crazy girls again, and does not even remember their names. Ricky thinks it's probably a good idea the two leave and look for Hasabe and Mami, the girls they are actually interested in. Enraged after this, the girls simply punch them to the moon and the game comes to an end, providing many players with arguably an underwhelming finish. On the bright side, at least, this unlocks Ricky and Kunio, so gamers have the opportunity to play the game again, this time as the lads if they are up for it. It turns out though there was an explanation behind this game's bizarre ending, which I will try my best to explain. As mentioned earlier in the video, the Kunio-kun series was bastardized through localizations in the West, with the story and characters being changed left, right and centre. As discussed, many games would never make it to our shores, including Kunio Tachi no Banka, the only beat 'em up to previously feature the two girls in this one as protagonists. In fact, throughout the series as a whole, Misako and Kayako's appearances are limited in comparison to Mami and Hasabe. Speaking of these girls, throughout the River City Girls adventure, they bump into these mean girls regularly, with them constantly mocking our pair of heroines who are insistent that Riki and Kunio have no interest in them. If players are able to defeat Sabuko at the end of the game to gain half of the charm, the other half can be gained by smashing all 25 Sabu statues. Gaining both halves of a charm unlocks one final secret boss fight against Mami and Hasabe. Hilariously, like in many moments throughout the game, plenty of fourth wall breaking is afoot, with even after their defeat, the pair of mean girls insisting that Misako and Kayako are nobodies who have only ever been in one 16-bit game, and that was not even released in the USA. So no wonder the boys would not be able to remember who they are. Talk about obscure. The true ending sees the girls once again crash the sauna, but this time being invited to join the lads for a Merv burger, bringing the game to a happy conclusion for our young ladies. Throughout a playthrough of River City Girls, gamers will be charmed by this title's amusing story that is packed to the brim with satire, in-jokes and Easter eggs galore for fans of the series to enjoy both old and new. Something I have yet to mention is that for a beat 'em up, this title is insanely long and takes about 6 hours to play through, which is an incredible length considering most arcade beat 'em ups only lasted like half an hour. River City Girls, on the other hand, through its story, graphics, gameplay and presentation, is extremely finely paced. So while on the rather long side for a game from this genre, you never feel tired or exasperated with the experience, as the music and gameplay is both equally chilled and action orientated enough to constantly keep you hungry for more. In fact, I am pretty sure this is now going to be one of those games I keep going back to play over and over again. It is just that bloody good, in my opinion.
After the critical and commercial success of the first River City Girls game, it is no surprise whatsoever that fans would be craving more. Fortunately for all of us at E3 of 2021, not only would it be announced we would be getting a sequel, but the first game featuring our girls that was originally a Japan-only Super Nintendo exclusive was announced to be relaunched as River City Girls Zero in the West. I'll go into detail on that one later, but first let's cover everything there is to know about the amazing sequel. While it's one thing learning about River City Girls 2 through playing it, what is even cooler is that fortunately there are plenty of interviews online from the creators of the title, allowing us a peek behind the curtain and the opportunity to find out even more about what makes the follow-up so special. Co-Optimus.com, for example, would speak with Bannon Rudis, one of the game's directors, who would explain that this new game and River City Girls Zero are highly connected, beyond just our heroines. He would confirm that River City Girls 2 sees the antagonists from that game make a return, and while there are mentions of them in River City Girls 1, they were intentionally held back as threats until this one. Linking the three River City Girls games further together, he also adds they differ from the River City Ransom games, in that the character sprites are huge, rather than chibi, like in the games starring Kunio. It is this art style that sets the franchise within a franchise apart. He also mentions that while a lot of the gameplay elements are the same between the two games he worked on, the sequel has 3 difficulties that players can choose from. The difficulty levels and balancing that was implemented are now more in favour of the players to help with facing multiple enemies at the same time. Building on the mechanical changes, he also adds that new techniques and moves were included in the game. These can really help players out in order to get into more advantageous situations. In Rudis' words, allowing players to creatively stomp the mess out of anyone they come across. The enemy recruitment feature that was included in the first game has also been refined. For example, if the opponent you are facing is the last enemy alive, you can get them down to about 20% health.
This time they glow yellow when they're stunned, and they will get up begging instead of simply appearing dizzy. It's little touches like this that make the game slightly better than its predecessor. Perhaps the most notable addition to River City Girls 2, and probably the change that generated the most discussion in the lead up to the release of the game, was the inclusion of 2 brand new ladies, who would be added to the story and roster. Of course, the first of these would be Muscle Mummy Marion, the famous damsel in distress from the Double Dragon series, who had previously featured as the shopkeeper in the last River City game. But here she would become playable, with even new lore being affixed to her explaining her buff body and newly acquired chiseled abs. In-game lore would suggest that she got sick of getting punched in the gut and kidnapped all the time in the Double Dragon games. So therefore she would make the effort to train hard, gain abs of steel, and ensure that she was never kidnapped again. Amusingly, I made a series of highly popular YouTube shorts around this character, poking fun at the discussion around whether or not Marion had gone woke. While just a joke, Rudis himself responded to one of these videos, setting the record regarding the design straight. He would comment that for those questioning her design in River City Girls 2, her design was done by the amazing Priscilla Hamby in the first game as a shop owner. We wanted her to look like she'd been punched many times in the abs. She nailed the look and we loved it. Then for part 2, her hair is white and she is taller than the rest of the cast, because she is supposed to be an adult while the others are teens. If you take a selfie as her, you will see she holds out her phone with both hands like you would see an older parent do. And on the couch, in the beginning, everyone is playing a video game, but she is confused what is happening. And side note, I wanted her to be the wrestler of the group, but also the boxer of the group, hence her moveset. So there you have it. Muscle Mummy Marion is not woke, but she is a boomer. A muscular MILF Marion, if you will. As for another new playable character in the game, this brings us to Provy. When speaking to Co-Optimus, Rudis reveals that the fighter is actually based on a real human. He comments, "So Provy is a real person and a friend of mine. I butchered her name for the first couple of years of knowing her. She never corrected me. It's pronounced Provy. In the game, she's best friends with a character named Chris, who would eventually start a gang of her own. They train together and Provy is the sassy one. The sassiness is definitely based on the real life Provy. Speaking of Provy lore, River City Girls 2 was not where she first made her debut either, but instead River City Ransom Underground, the first River City game that Rudis worked on. So an interesting callback there that weaves other projects closer to this one. In other changes that were made to the game, the navigation tool that helps us explore River City was also worked on, including the GPS functionality. This is partially because River City Girls 2 is much bigger than its predecessor, with Rudis adding that because of the sheer size of the map, the GPS had to be more helpful this time around for sure. I would say it's about 3 to 4 times the size. There are places that make return appearances, but they have changed visually to show the passage of time in the city. There are also whole new areas to explore as well. Playing through this game multiple times extensively, I can certainly confirm this to be true, with there being a wider area to explore than ever before. Speaking of exploration, I for example really enjoyed bumping into Skullmageddon again, one of my favourite video game characters of all time. Now gone straight and giving up supervillainy, there is a hilarious moment where he bumps into Marion, the very woman he fell in love with and kidnapped in the excellent Double Dragon Neon. After asking him if he kidnapped her to get her attention, he simply admits, well, that was generally how it was done back then. Little moments like this are amongst the many reasons the River City Girls games continue to amuse me. As for the story in this plot-heavy beat-em-up, it picks up where the first game left off, following the high schoolers as they fight their way through River City once again. This time they're joined by additional playable characters. From the start, Kunio and Ricky, and as already mentioned, Marion and Provy as progress is made. Each with their unique moves and abilities, there are reasons to try each of these fighters out. After the events of its predecessor, the city has calmed down, but it doesn't stay peaceful for long. The Yakuza gang, led by the Sanwakai crime family, makes its move to take over River City, and the girls quickly find themselves wrapped up in the chaos. The crew must fight their way through various districts, battling waves of enemies and tracking down the leaders of the Sanwakai family to stop their reign of terror. The primary antagonist of the game, Sabu, appears in this one, a villain who debuted many moons ago as far back as the original Kunio-kun arcade game. Ruthless and calculating, he returns to River City seeking revenge, but of course he is not alone. Previously a big part of River City Girls Zero, Ken returns, Sabu's son and right-hand man and an influential member of the family. He is a formidable fighter and plays a significant role in the gang's criminal operations, posing as a major threat to the heroes, albeit with some comic relief moments. Just like what came before it, boss fights in River City Girls 2 are dynamic, fast-paced and often require both strategy and quick reflexes. Each boss is designed with a unique set of attack patterns, abilities and phases, creating a variety of challenges for the player. These encounters often incorporate environmental hazards, such as moving platforms or traps, adding an extra challenge to the fight, and some bosses may summon minions or employ special abilities, requiring players to juggle between handling the main threat and managing additional enemies. It's typical classic beat-em-up stuff really. Though at times challenging, the boss fights are fair and rewarding, often leading to satisfying victories after learning their patterns and weaknesses. The mix of humour, intensity, and creative fight design in these encounters are sure to keep you engaged and entertained. Online multiplayer and 4-player local co-op support would also be implemented into River City Girls 2, making it stand out further from its predecessor. Rudis comments that this was decided the moment they finished the first game. Knowing that they would have at bare minimum 4 characters to play as, it just made sense. He really pushed for it because he thought the beat-em-ups really benefit from that party game atmosphere, and who's to disagree? In terms of making this possible, he adds that the biggest challenge came with balancing. How do you allow 4 players who can each do their own crazy double-digit combos to all attack one enemy in a corner and still make it fun and challenging? It took lots of tweaking and balancing. The more players you add in, the more enemies show up. There's lots of stuff happening behind the scenes to balance all that out. The other big challenge came with level designing, since you don't have to share the screen in online mode. I had to make sure enemies didn't gang up on one player, while the other one was hanging out by themselves in a corner of these massive levels. The game would release to a positive reception, with generally the only main criticism being that the game is too similar to its predecessor. However, when we bear in mind how good the first game was, is more of it really a bad thing? Where in my personal opinion, certainly not. On completion of creating this game, Rudis commented, "I just hope people can see what I was trying to achieve with the sequel. This game shouldn't feel like a quarter-munching beat-em-up. I really want it to feel like its own thing. This is a game for people that might finally convince people that never tried a fighting game or beat-em-up to give it a shot. It's also a game for hardcore combo maniacs and fighting game enthusiasts. I'm super excited to see what people can do in this game. I, along with lots of other people, would come to adore River City Girls 2, just as much as its previous installment, which makes it all the more awesome that new DLC content is being added to this already great game. Arriving this fall, River City Girls 2 will receive Double Dragon DLC. In the ever-evolving landscape of beat-em-up games, few franchises have left as lasting a mark as the Double Dragon series. And now, in a move sure to delight fans, the legendary martial artist brothers Billy and Jimmy Lee are stepping into the world of River City Girls 2. For many, this moment is a long time coming, considering how closely Double Dragon and River City have always been linked. So seeing them finally become playable in River City Girls 2 will serve as an awesome moment indeed. Footage shows us that in this latest adventure, the twin brothers will bring their full arsenal of punches, kicks, and devastating special moves, including of course their signature spinning cyclone kicks and rising knee strikes to the game. As a self-proclaimed Double Dragon superfan, this obviously all sounds amazing. But adding to the excitement, we can also look forward to more music composed by the ever-talented Megan McDuffie, the same great artist featured in a lot of the great music from the first game. Reportedly, while Billy and Jimmy are out taking on the streets, a new dojo master steps in, offering players more challenges to overcome. And in addition to this premium DLC, a free update will be available to all players, adding fresh content including a Double Dragon themed motion comic, new shops, accessories and more, ensuring that the already quirky world of River City Girls 2 continues to expand. I, for one, can't wait to try out this new content, which should make River City Girls 2 even better. Turning back the clock to around this time last year, when I learned that a new Double Dragon game was being made, I'll be honest, I was excited, but at the same time, I was a bit worried. Double Dragon may be a franchise that established the cooperative beat-em-up genre, but at the same time, the series has always been like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. For every all-time great, such as Double Dragon 2 The Revenge, or the amazing Double Dragon Advance, there are embarrassing turds, such as Double Dragon 5 or the dreadful Xbox 360 game. So holding these thoughts with the next chapter being written in Bimmy and Jimmy's roller coaster of an adventure, I was keen yet apprehensive to see what the next installment would bring to the table. If you don't know already, let me tell you now, I freaking love Double Dragon and have always found the history of the series thoroughly fascinating. For this reason, I'm the only man on YouTube who's been crazy enough to upload singular deep dive videos covering every game from the franchise up until this point. In an equally crazy move, I even compiled the main parts of these into a ridiculously long 3-hour and 20-minute documentary. So I feel I have a decent grasp of what a good Double Dragon game is, and equally as importantly, what isn't. In fact, I have such an interest in these titles that I'm actually tempted to revisit them all soon and cover all of them all over again. I'm just that passionate about the series. Back in May of last year, I received an email in my inbox and a couple of YouTube comments that gave me goosebumps. These communications were from a man who was in charge of making the next entry in the Double Dragon series, who was contacting me to tell me that not only was a new Double Dragon game on the way, but he had been using this very channel as a research tool to learn more about the franchise and what fans liked and disliked about each of the games. This blew my mind, because it meant I had gone from nostalgically covering Double Dragon's past to, in my own minor way, influencing the legendary series' future. There is nothing more satisfying as a so-called professional influencer than apparently influencing things. So for this reason, I take full complete credit for Double Dragon going back in the right direction. Jokes aside, the man I spoke to on multiple occasions now over the last year, Raymond Teo, and his team deserve all the credit. Rise of the Dragons is an absolute magnificent game. It's incredibly addictive and has turned out awesome. But as we dig deep into the stupendousness of this game, with now the inclusion of free DLC, it's also worth discussing its development history and how we got this great game in the first place. Raymond Teo is a Singapore native, still living and operating from there to this day. Like the majority of you watching this channel, Raymond grew up gaming, with him personally starting on the NES before moving on to the Mega Drive, Super Nintendo and so forth. This meant he experienced the likes of the original Double Dragon, Streets of Rage, etc. all in their primes. By the time he had grown up, he alongside a friend would start a multimedia design studio, and one of the elements of their business was creating advertising games. These were usually just micro games made using Flash, but Raymond recalls it being one of the most entertaining elements of his job. Not long after starting this endeavour, the Singapore government announced that they were offering a small grant to those that want to make video games. So he took the leap of faith to leave the design studio and start making games full-time instead. This was around 2008, so it was unclear how much money he could actually make with indie games. So would try everything from Flash games to Xbox Live indie games and mobile ones, with him eventually settling down on Steam. After a decade plying his trade, in 2018 one of his games known as Streets of Red was released on consoles, a zombie-themed beat-em-up. When creating this critically well-received game, Raymond notes that he learned a lot from this project, and it was this very game that helped him the most in developing a Double Dragon game. Streets of Red gave him and those he worked with an instant head start on making Double Dragon Gaiden what it is, not just in terms of the feedback they gathered, but also how to build the tech needed that allowed them to create so many characters that can be played so differently. The wisdom from working on Streets of Red reduced the time they would have needed experimenting, and instead gave them more time to make things work and make things fun. But still, none of this answers the question of how they went from working on this indie project to a legendary IP like Double Dragon. So, how did this happen? Well, according to Raymond, back when Streets of Red was first released on Steam in 2015 under the title of Devil's Dare, Arc System Works would be impressed with the game and reach out to him. Unfortunately, he'd already signed with a publisher at the time, so a collaboration did not happen. But in 2018, remembering their interest in his work, Raymond would decide to reach out back to them. Raymond recalled they had actually acquired the Double Dragon IP and just released Double Dragon 4 in 2017. He notes Double Dragon 4 was developed by the original Double Dragon developers, and you can tell it's a love letter to the classic NES version. Since they just tried that, he wondered if they would be interested in a version that pushes the IP in a much newer direction, so reached out to them and pitched his grand vision. Raymond adds they really liked his ideas and appreciated his knowledge of the beat-em-up IP genre as a whole, but even then it seemed way too big of an IP to give it to a relatively unknown indie developer. Still, Raymond pushed, and after an entire year of discussion and persistence, he finally managed to convince them to let him make a Double Dragon game. As awesome as this opportunity was, as we've seen in the past, making a good Double Dragon game is no easy feat, with there certainly being barriers in the way that could hinder Raymond's chances. Double Dragon Gaiden Rise of the Dragons would be developed by Secret Base, who Raymond admits is mainly just him. He is the founder of the company and the creative vision holder, who tasked himself with handling design, art, and the production of the new Double Dragon. To achieve this, he worked with project partner Shun Yu, who was in charge of all the programming and technical challenges, with the core team being just the two of them. Of course, to make a beat-em-up capable of competing with the best, like Shredder's Revenge and Streets of Rage 4, a game of such a scope cannot be done with just two people, so therefore they had the help of student interns and part-time designers. Two lads, Ray and Nicholas, worked with them during the late alpha and early beta stages of development, working on AI, character balancing, level integration, and so on. To make development more of a tall task, the project was also done during the pandemic, so they had lots of help from freelance animators, composers, etc. from all over the world. Raymond notes that logistically it was crazy managing everyone from all parts of the world by himself, but it was also amazing to have everyone coming together to create such a special game. Perhaps most impressive about all of this is that the project was actually self-funded, and Raymond ended up spending every penny he had ever made in the past to get this done. What made this the most challenging was because every licensed game has a time limit. Due to this, he had to get the game finished on time. The game was pretty much already done by the time they reached out to Modus to get funding for porting, QA support and help with marketing, so they could get the word out. Overall, Raymond notes that it was an extremely tough challenge to get this game done, with them introducing something new at every turn. Double Dragon Gaiden, being self-funded, also had a much smaller budget than other modern beat-em-ups, so trying to finish everything before the deadline was rough. Worst of all, halfway through development, Shun Yu, the game's only programmer, fell seriously ill and was not able to work for months. The illness badly affected his ability to speak, and it was unclear if he could continue to work on the project. Raymond notes they had already spent so much money, they had no choice but to continue. Only the two of them knew about this, as they didn't want to worry anybody else, and it was a lot to bear. Miraculously, they managed to effectively communicate with each other and kept the project moving, and thankfully Shun Yu got better as time went by. But Raymond adds it was 12 months of hell that he wouldn't wish on his worst enemy. So, as you can probably tell from all of this, nothing was stopping these boys from trying to produce simply one of the greatest Double Dragon games ever made. Grit, determination, blood, sweat and tears all went into this insane project. So let's begin to start talking about the results of a Double Dragon title that was secretly years in the making. Upon powering the game on, we instantly hear the classic Double Dragon theme tune, making long-term fans of the franchise feel pumped and at home right from the get-go. Before selecting story mode on the main menu, the option is there to also learn how to play at the bottom, which it does a great job of informing us about some of the changes this game contains to previous entries in the series. This option educates us that when playing story mode, we have the opportunity to earn and spend cash while playing the game. This cash can be gathered by defeating enemies and found within breakable objects, and when a game is over, the remaining cash is converted into tokens, which can be used to unlock new content in the game shop. That's right, unlike modern games that make you pay using real world money to get unlockable DLC, Like games of old, Double Dragon Gaiden is packed to the brim with content that you instead must unlock through skill and perseverance, instantly giving us a reason to keep coming back for more. Building on the in-game money-making mechanic, when starting a new game in Gaiden, we the player can tweak the difficulty before a playthrough using the new game modifier. Essentially, changing the difficulty will also affect the token exchange rate, so the more you challenge yourself, the higher the reward will be on offer. Why can't all modern games reward us like this for getting good at them? In terms of improving this lucrative cash flow further, knocking out opponents using special moves results in them spilling more cash, and if you can manage to knock out multiple opponents at once with one of these blows, the rewards get even higher, including them dropping items that allow us to regain health. These triple or quadruple KOs are known as crowd controls, and are incredibly satisfying to pull off. Perhaps the most innovative feature, and one I cannot recall seeing in a beat 'em up before this one, is tag team action players. Holla holla holla. If you can remember how the tag team feature works in Marvel vs Capcom games, we have something similar in this one. Each character in play has a special meter, which can either be used to perform special moves or instead used to tag in your second character. Basically, on the player select screen at the start of a playthrough, you select two characters and can tag out whenever you have taken a lot of damage, or when you simply want to extend the combo. The character who has been switched out, like in Marvel vs Capcom, can also regenerate a portion of their HP, further adding to the strategy in this one. Every time you perform one of your extremely useful special moves, your special meter enters a cooldown phase to prevent naughty spamming. Fortunately, the meter recovers over time anyway, but the opportunity is there to speed it up by hitting or defeating enemies. If you like experimenting, different moves use different amounts of SP. Each character has specials that are useful for defense, and another for range, with a third that is unique to them, giving us plenty of options to try out. If your character gets knocked out, it is possible to revive them or purchase upgrades with your cash at the end of each sector. And as mentioned earlier, remaining cash after a playthrough is converted into tokens, with the additional bonus of your score being placed on the global leaderboard. Want to know something amusing? When this game first came out, due to getting a head start from owning a review copy for a while, I had the highest Double Dragon score on the entire planet, which not only made me the Double Dragon World Champion, but also the Wizard. Now let's touch on the game's story. Upon embarking on a story mode playthrough, we are shown an amazingly old school looking cutscene informing us that in the year 1990X AD, the world is in a state of decay. A nuclear war has ravaged cities and the population struggles to survive. New York City is now ruled by 4 major gangs. As the gangs fight for total dominance, riots and crime consume the streets. One day, at the Bimmy and Jimmy's dojo, a man we have never seen before walks in exclaiming, "Is anyone here?" This young lady needs help. Bimmy and Jimmy notice the woman is Marion and check on her to see if she's okay. The man explains he has not hurt her and he is the city's new mayor. Officer Marion was caught in a gang conflict during a patrol, but he managed to get her out. The mayor states he is looking for Bimmy and Jimmy's father and master of a dojo to bring the thugs down, but a new character known as Martin steps in, informing the mayor he went missing. Marion, Bimmy and Jimmy decide they want to rage through the streets in a final fight against the gangs, begging this mysterious Uncle Martin to join them. Do so he does, and the adventure is on, but who even is Uncle Martin? Well, fortunately, I got full clarification from Raymond. With his introduction, Raymond adds, it was mostly a question of who to include in the starting roster. Billy and Jimmy are the must-have balance characters, and Marion was quite an easy choice because she's highly recognisable, and her identity as a police officer would allow interesting gun gameplay. For the fourth character, he wanted someone new to spice things up. Grapples are really popular, so he was first designed as a wrestler, but he thought since Marion uses a gun, it would be interesting if he uses a shield to complement that. On top of that, he also thought that a lot of gamers are probably older now, and since Double Dragon Gaiden is sort of an alternate timeline prequel, everyone is a lot younger. So he made him an older man, as he imagined a lot of players might play with their kids now, and they can play as Uncle Martin to protect them. As to the name Matin, he always found it intriguing that there was this building with the word Matin on it in the original arcade game. If the brothers lived there, you'd imagine it saying Susetsu Ken Dojo or something like that. So when he came up with a character, who's supposed to be a guardian to the young Lee brothers, he thought it'd probably make more sense for him to be the owner of that place. Upon choosing your two characters for a playthrough, differently from previous Double Dragon games, we are brought to a mission select screen, where, like in a Mega Man game, we get to choose the order of which boss and stage area we tackle first. Speaking of which, the idea of including multiple different gangs with unique identities in the game is a nod to the Warriors, which is interesting as the reskin of Kunio-kun for the Western market known as Renegade was also inspired by the Warriors, so a nice callback there. Some of these crime lords you will recognise from previous games, such as the iconic Machine Gun Willie, or how about Duke, the often forgotten final boss from Super Double Dragon, due to the fact the team ran out of time and never got round to creating cutscenes to help fully establish him. When taking on these missions, what is particularly interesting is that the stage completely changed based on which order you choose to tackle them in, with the later you leave a gang unpunished, the more they will expand their operations and take over more sectors. This means you only have to clear one sector when tackling the first gang, but 3 sectors for the later crime lords. This means there are a variety of different routes to take through the game, with different sectors to rampage through depending on the choices you make. In a separate interview with Game Rant, Raymond commented on this implementation, adding it was included as it really has to do with replayability. I understand with past beat 'em up games, like in our memory, those games lasted for quite a while. In truth though, a lot of these games were less than 60 minutes. Then you replay them again and again and again. This time around, I wanted to make sure that when you replay the game, there were different things that you can explore and alternate routes. With each run, the players can actually change to a different character or combination of characters. They can explore different routes. Each time they play, they will see different things that enhance the experience and keep them gaming. Throughout these playthroughs, you will notice Easter eggs and stage features aplenty that are callbacks to various other games in the series. Raymond notes that not only did he use all the games for inspiration, but even the movie and the animated TV show too. This game really is a celebration of everything Double Dragon. Speaking of everything Double Dragon, this is too reflected in the game's music, with each piece from the game's soundtrack being amazing rearrangements of various iconic catchy tunes from this franchise's iconic past. This game is amazing. Adding to the excellence of all of this, we of course also now have the extra DLC content. Remember those tokens we mentioned earlier? Well, thanks to the DLC, we not only have brand new ways to collect them, but more awesome characters to unlock using them too. Through using such tokens, we could already unlock some amazing fighters, who could be made playable alongside the game's initial 4 base selectable ones. These include classic imposing brutal behemoths such as Burnoff and Abobo, professional iconic dominatrix Linda, and Chintai Mi, along with all 5 of the game's boss characters. Joining this motley crew, we now have 3 more to unlock, so let's run through them. First we have Chin-Si Mi, the master of the fierce tiger splendid mountain fist, who first appeared as a boss in Mission 2 in Double Dragon 3. If defeated, the slow moving fighter could become a member of the team's party, and he's back for this adventure too. Also first debuting as a boss in the arcade version of Double Dragon 3, Yagyu Ranzoi makes a return, a ninja master member of a secret society of assassins. But it is the 3rd throwback to this much maligned arcade game who interests me the most. I am of course referring to the comeback of the infamous Sonny Lee, a man who seemed to be the mysterious 3rd Lee brother who seemingly went missing for decades. Hilariously though, he seems to be making somewhat of a comeback tour in recent years, with his appearance in Double Dragon Gaiden seemingly being his most remarkable appearance yet. After being missing for 27 years, he resurfaced as a playable fighter in Double Dragon 4, but we were given no background story, allowing us to know anything more about this enigmatic character. In 2022, he would show up in River City Girls 2, a game which would hilariously depict him proclaiming he is the 3rd Double Dragon brother, with other characters in the game, Marion included, claiming they don't have a clue who he is. Here he defensively replies that just because he doesn't appear in every adventure doesn't mean he isn't just as important as the other Lees. But the girls state that is exactly what it means. As for his emergence in Double Dragon Gaiden, this provides the greatest depiction of the character yet, providing the most lore around this fighter that any game was provided in history. It states that Sonny is the lazy, distant cousin of the Lee brothers, but just like Billy and Jimmy, he's practiced the art of Susetsuken since he was young. However, Sonny has a hard time keeping up. He opts to give the ancient technique his own creative spin, and now wanders the streets to test the might of his new moves. Essentially fighting with what looks more like a drunken fist style of martial arts, it looks like between this video game and River City Girls 2, Sonny is sort of being positioned as the Dan Hibiki of the Double Dragon universe. And it kind of works. I also like that in both of these games he looks incredibly tired and drug ruined, leaving us to guess who knows what he's been up to in the 27 years he went missing. When speaking to the PlayStation blog about this character, Raymond states that as a fighter, Sonny distinguishes himself as a rushdown offensive warrior. He executes an action attack similar to a quick breakdance maneuver that travels a short distance and covers threats from all directions. Despite his Susetsuken roots, we wanted to ensure that Sonny is his own character, and he is designed to play differently from Billy and Jimmy with much more eccentric moves. His role as the familial outcast significantly influences his fighting style, resulting in a blend of showboating and non-traditional stances. Sonny's distinctive approach to combat reflects his individuality within the family dynamic, which gives him more depth and personality, allowing him to shine brighter in the game. Beyond adding the best lead to the game, both a versus mode and online co-op mode have been added to the title, the latter of which has been long time requested by fans. Out of the new play mode additions though, my personal favourite is the game's survival mode, which allows us to play stage after stage, wiping out wave after wave of enemies, with the difficulty being increased each round. When we pair this with the reward of getting far more tokens the deeper you can survive into this play mode, like most other elements of this title, it's incredibly addictive, and the feature of the title I am finding myself revisiting the most at present. Something I have yet to touch on, which I feel I perhaps should, is the game's graphics. I recall when we first looked at the trailer for this game last year, my comment section in particular were not big fans of the game's art style, with the most common complaint being that they did not feel this looked like a Double Dragon game. My personal response to that would be, what the bloody hell does a Double Dragon game even look like? As from my memory, playing every game in the series, the graphical styles and art direction taken game to game is even more varied than the franchise's roller coaster quality. Even the arcade games and NES games that share the same names look completely different from one another, and Double Dragon 5 looks nothing like Double Dragon Neon, and that game looks nothing like the Double Dragon movie game for the Neo Geo arcade. What sews most of the franchise together, in my opinion, is the series' recurring music, and this one, as mentioned, has all the iconic tracks in abundance. As you've probably seen from my leaderboard score I showed you, I enjoyed this game a lot when it came out, and I've chosen to play through it over and over, checking out different routes and different bosses. In fact, since the game's DLC has been released, I have now put so much time into the game that I have unlocked all of its Steam achievements too, including the completionist one, which apparently only 5% of players manage to unlock. The game is highly addictive, easily the most addictive Double Dragon game I've ever played, and in my opinion, in terms of fun factor, right up there with Streets of Rage 4 and Shredder's Revenge. This game is just that freaking good. Perhaps one of the craziest features amongst the many unlockables are the huge roster of additional playable characters, each with their own strengths, weaknesses and special moves. A feature of the game that has only got more insane since the addition of the DLC. After all, who doesn't have a strange fascination with the curiosity that is Sonny Lee? Due to this cornucopia of characters, the experimentation options are absolutely tremendous, leading to excellent replayability. Questioning Raymond further about this fantastic game, he stated that he thinks a great beat 'em up is one that makes you come back for more and helps you de-stress after a hard day at work. Or they just function as games you want to turn on and have a good time. In the past, they used to be great arcade experiences where you and your friend could have a memorable time together, and imagine those same people from back in the day are now older and play the game with their kids too. As for the genre's rise in popularity, he thinks the community has always been there for these sort of games, with the videos on my channel for example proving there is a crowd who are highly passionate about these titles. As for their disappearance and recent re-emergence, Raymond suggests that AAA studios never want to make them, and indie developers were not able to handle them up until recent years. This is because beat-em-ups require a lot of intense artwork and animation, and players expect them to not only be multiplayer, but they must be online as well, making it such a high barrier of entry for indie developers. Part of the reason why we're seeing more of them now is because the indie scene is getting more and more saturated, so developers are looking to make genres that others couldn't or haven't, so as to stand out from the crowd. At the same time, the tools have now made certain development work easier, and the teams are getting bigger, allowing developers to take on bigger games. This is why beat-em-ups are back and only getting better and better. As for Dragon Gaiden, Raymond wishes to introduce some new design experience to the genre and to hopefully push it forward, even if just a little. The franchise has had a rocky history, so he hopes that players can see the effort that has been put in to bring the Double Dragon franchise back into the limelight. As for what he is most proud of all with this one, it's the game's looping nature and how players are motivated to play the game repeatedly to unlock more characters, adjust for difficulty and play again. I've already played this game thoroughly and absolutely love it, but I thought it would be interesting to ask Raymond how he would sell the experience to others, with him informing me that if you're a fan of the beat-em-up genre in general, he believes you will find enjoyment in the many innovations they've introduced to the game, ranging from the tagging mechanic, roguelite elements, and the many different unique characters you can play as. And if you're not familiar with the genre, he'd say beat-em-ups are traditionally the easiest action games you can get into and have fun with. The game's dynamic difficulty allows you to tweak the difficulty how you like it, and allows you to learn and get better, and you can slowly increase the difficulty as you improve. Don't be frightened of the roguelite elements they have implemented, as the goal of a game is not to kill the player repeatedly, but for you to play and win repeatedly, each time trying to do better than your last try. And speaking of which, I guess it is for these very reasons why I found myself so bloody addicted to this game, finding the same enjoyment from it playing it today as I did last year. Dragon Gaiden Rise of the Dragons is simply stupendous, and perhaps the greatest Double Dragon game ever made, and most certainly the most enjoyable in the modern era. Combine all this with free DLC that has expanded this experience even further, how can you not be a super fan of this product? I highly recommend that you buy this game and play it now. Beat-em-ups don't get better than this one. Anyway, if you like the look of this one, check it out now, and if you already own it, jump on that free DLC. I promise you won't be disappointed. 33 years ago, history was made as Streets of Rage saw a release on the Sega Mega Drive. The game was instantly special and a crowd pleaser, especially due to the fact that the game was a system exclusive that played like the popular Final Fight, but actually offered two-player cooperative play, something that the home version of Final Fight on the Super Nintendo failed to offer consumers of the period. As cool as this game was, little did fans of the era know that the best was yet to come, and the emergence of an even better sequel. 1992 would see the release of Streets of Rage 2, a huge technically impressive game that was worked on by multiple development teams that topped all of the action that could be found in the first Streets of Rage game. In fact, the title is so good that many people still look at it as the greatest Sega game ever made to this day. It's just that special. Speaking of the classic trilogy, it was rounded off in 1994 with the release of Streets of Rage 3. While not as popular a game as those which came before, the title still brought a lot to the table, including more playable characters than ever before, including multiple unlockable ones. Sadly though, this would be the last Streets of Rage game ever released, or at least so we thought, for a very, very long time. Over the years, Streets of Rage programmer and composer Yuzo Koshiro claims he rallied Sega for a full Streets of Rage game, each time never getting the green light he wanted. Others have attempted to get the Streets of Rage license for their own games in the past too. For example, Core Design's title Fighting Force was a 3D beat-em-up that was created in 1997 with the hope that they would be able to call their game Streets of Rage, and Ruffian Games, the developer behind Crackdown 2, also tried its hand at a reboot on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, with all of these efforts ultimately failing. With it very much looking like the Streets of Rage franchise was long dead and buried, most series fans had come to the conclusion that it was in their best interest to look at the ambitious fan project known as Streets of Rage Remake as the closest thing they were ever going to get to a full Streets of Rage entry. While this one is certainly incredible, it still wasn't the genuine article. Everything would, however, one day change when a series of fortunate events would unfold that would eventually lead to Streets of Rage 4 becoming a reality. But how did this long fantasy held by many actually come true? Well, to understand why Streets of Rage 4 was published, we first have to briefly look at a game that was developed by those who worked on the full Streets of Rage prior to making the modern beat-em-up classic, and that game is the remake of Wonder Boy: The Dragon's Trap. This lovingly well-crafted title was handled by the development house known as Lizard Cube. Here, programmer Omar Cornut and artist Ben Fike reverse-engineered the Master System code, which would lead them to work with Wonder Boy 3's original game designer Ryuichi Nishizawa in producing a remake of the beloved original game. The team single-handedly and painstakingly reproduced all of the game's original art and animation, depicting it in a modern art style. The whole feat was extremely impressive, leaving gamers to wonder what Lizard Cube would be up to next. Whilst this Wonder Boy title was developed by Lizard Cube, the game was actually published by a fellow French company known as Dotemu. According to their website, their mission statement is as follows. Dotemu is a French video game company specialising in modern releases of beloved retro games. Our mission is simple: give every gamer access to yesteryear's classic video games on today's platforms, including PC, mobile, console and more. Working alongside the world's most cherished and recognised publishers, the Dotemu team has published a number of global top sellers across both PC and console, including Wonder Boy: The Dragon's Trap, Windjammers, several games in the Yeast series, and more. Founded in 2007, Dotemu leverages its considerable technological know-how to maintain the original spirit of classic games, while giving them a second life as rediscovered gems for a new generation of gamers. The critical response to Wonder Boy 3, The Dragon's Trap, and what Lizard Cube and Dotemu managed to impressively do with such an old license was enough to earn Sega's trust to allow them to develop a Streets of Rage 4, a title that many had proposed but been rejected to make in the past. The collaborative effort between Lizard Cube and Dotemu would also be aided by a company known as Guard Crush Games, who oversaw the gameplay elements of this brand new beat-em-up. They were chosen to partake in the project due to their passion for classic beat-em-ups and side-scrolling titles. The team at the time were best known for their Xbox 360 release Streets of Fury, and follow-up on the PC, Streets of Rage Fury Extended Edition. Streets of Fury revelled in over-the-top action and captured the studio's love for fun side-scrolling brawlers. These combined forces created the perfect recipe to make Streets of Rage 4 the special game fans desired. But before we can discuss what was delivered, let's first touch more on this historic title's development process. When it came to sculpting the title, the game's artists had a tall challenge to take on, and that was to come up with artwork which they felt would best represent the Streets of Rage series in 2020. This job was overseen by Lizard Cube's art director Ben Fike and lead background artist Julian Nguyen Yu. Ben Fike states that after Wonder Boy: The Dragon's Trap, which we did in association with Dotemu, we wanted to bring back some games that we really liked, and for me, Streets of Rage, which was a Sega license, and which I particularly liked, came to mind right away. Artistically speaking, in Streets of Rage, there were lots of things which are ingrained, like the urban feel, the neon, the bricks, and the ground. Those have really stayed strong in our memories, and I think it has always been an underlying inspiration. As soon as you think of characters fighting in the streets, very quickly we have had the idea of showing the story and the characters at a later time. The story takes place 10 years after Streets of Rage 3. Because the fans who have been waiting for this sequel for a long time, they've gotten older, have grown up, and the whole thing with these young, fiery kids in the streets wasn't working any longer with the way the fans are now. For a lot of people, the first level ties in with that Streets of Rage feeling you used to have, because I think that's the level where you spent the most time. Julian Nguyen Yu adds in relation to this stage, that is where players spend the most time. Also, that's where they tried things. They added a corner which was very difficult to do at the time. We tried to pay homage to that infrastructure of the first level in level 1 of Streets of Rage 4. Ben Fike adds the way we thought of it was really as a tribute, in particular to Streets of Rage 2, with that street corner with the car that crashes into the wall, which was something they wanted to do and was in the game design documents of the original game, and that they weren't actually able to do because of technical limitations. So here we wanted to pay homage to all of that. In regards to the character designs, Ben mentions that if you look at the original blueprints of the character designs from the 90s, the developers were forced to use pixel art due to limitations of the period. Whereas now, they could represent the characters in the game in the original manga art style that developers would have originally opted for if the technology was there. The use of heavy black lines around the characters also pays homage to the originals of paper character designs. Ben also comments on what it was like working on a game with such high expectations, adding that this is a game which holds a special place in a lot of fans' hearts, and there's a fine line between pleasing people and creating something new. The thing that I'm very happy about is that the fans thanked us a lot, and there was a huge number of fans who are delighted to have new Streets of Rage and a new game which seems to them to be very high quality. The game's main designer was a gentleman known as Jordi Asensio. Jordi was an early active member in the fighting game community, who as a result was also drawn to beat 'em ups with a particular special love for Guardian heroes. Speaking on Streets of Rage 4, he mentions that making a sequel is one of the hardest things to do. You must first figure out what was so good about the original games. Jordi views Streets of Rage 2 as the ultimate entry in the Streets of Rage series, so he chose to design the gameplay featured in Streets of Rage 4 around the second entry. In fact, he even states that he played both games side by side and tried to control both of them simultaneously to make sure he could match them in terms of the rhythm and feeling. Nowadays, we have a really mechanical idea of what game design must be. It has to be really precise, but this is just one part of the job. Another point is that game design is a way of consuming the content of the game. He states that the game's feel and level of ease it was to work on was hugely helped by Guard Crush Games' fantastic engine he was provided with to work on. Head of programming Cyril Lagarigu mentions that the engine was based off of one previously used when they released Streets of Fury on the Xbox 360. They would improve it a lot though for Streets of Rage 4. Jordi claims that we discussed every possible question about beat-em-ups. We also analysed fighting games frame by frame to understand which tools we needed exactly. We tried to rebuild it all. We tried to think like the game makers from that time, and with the modern technology that we have nowadays, we tried to create a tool which allowed us to develop this type of game on a top level. He goes on to add that when you create a sequel of a game, you shouldn't be overexcited. The common mistake is trying to add today's trends. You don't need to implement RPG mechanics, you don't want to over-modernize the game. You need to understand frustrations of that time and to figure out if these frustrations were due to technical limitations or idea limitations. In regards to working on such a huge project, Jordi rounds off with, at the beginning, you don't realise the pressure because you're working on the game of your dreams, so you are very motivated. And then, after the first announcement, when you start showing things, the fans begin to react in every sense of the word. On one hand, it motivates you because some find it really cool, but on the other hand, people criticise you quite harshly. But you must accept that because there are always reasons behind criticism. It's very important to look at what people do and say, even if sometimes it hurts, and to analyse where this feeling comes from. Meanwhile, the pressure gets harder, but since the game is good, it's fine. So now we have looked at both the creation of the game's art direction and the gameplay, but what about its music? One of the most standout features of previous Streets of Rage games. In regards to this, Olivier de Rivière was brought on board by Cyril Imbert as the game's main composer. He states that the idea was, we needed an artist who could do most of the music, but in a very special and modern way, but with the same spirit as was in the previous series. And that was when we started to think about Olivier de Rivière. looking at his work, looking at everything he did in his different works in the past, so he can create something that gets the perfect fusion of gameplay and music. Streets of Rage is all about the fusion of gameplay and music. Playing Streets of Rage is like listening to an album, but an interactive album. Olivier de Riviere, in his new role, straight away decided he did not want to replicate the works of Yuzo Koshiro because he felt he could not do a good job of replicating someone else's unique music on the basis that it would feel wrong to everybody. So it was not to be disrespectful, but also to let him have his own take as part of this project. Yuzo could inject his own flavour into Streets of Rage 4. Speaking of the return of Streets of Rage during the game's development, Yuzo Koshiro commented, "Streets of Rage came out on the Mega Drive, however, it wasn't that popular in Japan. It performed better in the United States and Europe. To be honest, I had pitched a sequel to the series a few times, however Sega wasn't interested at the time. It was about 20 years ago. I find it interesting that a French team is working on it today. It is exciting to see a new modern day Streets of Rage game not coming from Japan, but from overseas. Motohiro Karashima and I used to work on the Streets of Rage series by ourselves. I'm interested to see the musical universe resulting from a collaboration between multiple artists. All of them obviously very talented musicians and composers, so I expect the result to be truly enjoyable sound." Amongst the many musicians working on the game, these included Shimomura, a former Capcom employee. In regards to her, Yuzo states, "I find it funny because Shimomura used to work on Street Fighter 2 originally. Sega's president at the time ordered that we do better than Street Fighter 2 with Streets of Rage. It is funny because this was our starting point when working on the game. I felt it is a strange turn of events that I end up working with Shimomura, who was working on that game at the time." Motohiro Karashima, another man who worked on the original trilogy's legendary soundtrack, adds, "Yuzo already completed 2 tracks. Back in the day, we were aiming at creating new sounds using the built-in systems of the 90s. Working now on Streets of Rage 4, I wondered whether pursuing new sounds was the right answer. Originally, we made what we wanted to make, which gave Streets of Rage. However, I realised that making what I want to make now wouldn't give the same results, which is why I felt a bit troubled. At the start, I listened back to the original Streets of Rage, wondering what made the essence of the game. I then came up with an answer. I felt that Streets of Rage wasn't based on melodies, it was phrases woven with each other, like paths knitted together. I wondered how to express that Streets of Rage sound, then worked on creating that universe with today's tools." Yuzo Koshiro continues the conversation by adding, "Originally the Streets of Rage music is heavily inspired by club music from the late 80s to early 90s. Working on the project today, I wondered about the approach to take, whether it should be modern using EDM for example. I thought about it, then came to the conclusion that I should be creating things that I wasn't able to make at the time. Also, looking at the fans' opinions on the internet, I saw many of them were expecting a sound close to the original. I thought that using the same original tools could be a good approach as well. I reused the old synths and drum machines of the time, re-recorded for sound, then made the song in a serious way. While working on Streets of Rage 4, I listened to the music that influenced me on Spotify and YouTube. I wanted to feel and regain what drove me at that time." According to Olivier de Riviere, the head composer himself, he states that each boss fight in the game consists of a different track, composed by different musicians, to make each fight feel more special. He also mentions that he and the other composers spent a lot of time working alongside the game's designers to work out their intentions throughout each intricate part of the game. This helped make the music more consistent with players' experiences. The music was designed so that it would increase players' adrenaline as they progressed through the stages. Olivier summarises in regards to working on the music that working on Streets of Rage 4 was the scariest thing he has ever done in his life, and it was frightening in every aspect. He said it was a huge honour, he did the best he could and hopes players enjoy it, but it is very difficult to come after such legendary composers, and as a result is very grateful to have been part of the whole project. So now we have looked in depth at how the game came to be and all of its development cycle, I guess it's time to start discussing what players could find once in possession of this game. For the first time in an official Streets of Rage entry, Streets of Rage 4 offers up to 4-player cooperative play, which can be experienced locally. In fact, the game also allows for online play, another brand new element for the franchise. Like in Streets of Rage games of the past, the objective is simple. Players fight their way through stages, taking out wave after wave of enemies, raging through the streets in classic fashion. A lot of the usual features are back too, such as disposable weapons and items to pick up, which can be used to gain points or restore health. In addition to this, there are also stars that players can pick up, which relate to being able to execute a technique known as star moves, which we shall discuss more about in a moment. Players have the ability to perform standard attacks, throws, blitz moves, or more powerful special attacks at the cost of a small portion of the user's health. In a new feature, it is possible to restore spent health on these special attacks by performing successive follow-up attacks without getting hit. The game features a nice counting system that records how many successful attacks you can land in a row, which gives you a little extra added motivation for not being hurt by your opponents. This new combo system also allows players to satisfyingly juggle opponents against walls and other players. In regards to the star moves, which can be performed by collecting the stars in each level, these are powerful attacks, a bit like the summoning of the police car in the series' original entry. The game's main gameplay mode is known as Story Mode, where players make their way through the story, fighting their way through 12 beautiful stages, each with their own unique boss encounter at the end of each gauntlet. How challenging this experience is depends on which difficulty setting players choose. There are 5 options in total, ranging from easy to mania, which dictate the experience players are delivered with. If you want to beat the game with little in the way of a competition, then easy mode is for you. But if you are a complete sadist, mania is there for all players if you want to attempt it. An interesting feature that this game has introduced is the title's lifetime score. This sees awarded points based on how much you challenge yourself, and after reaching each point milestone in the game's lifetime scoring system, new unlockables become available, giving the game not just an edge of replayability, but an extra incentive for you to challenge yourself more. This game is as much about the carrot as it is about the stick. Unlike the traditional Streets of Rage games of old, in Story Mode, which is a new feature in general, when a game over screen is reached, players can save the game and try every stage they are stuck on as many times as they like. Difficulty is determined not just by how tough the enemies are, but how many items are available, and also the amount of lives players start with at the beginning of each stage. Players have incentives to keep plugging away, and upon clearing each stage, ranks are given to the player based on how many points they could score, leading to the desire of playing the same stages over and over again. Away from story mode, there is also an arcade mode, which plays more like the Streets of Rage games of old, where players must make their way through the entire game with a limited amount of lives. There is also a level select, so that players can practice whatever stage they like. A battle mode, which basically acts as a mini fighting game feature, where players fight against each other, and a boss rush mode to fight against the game's bosses. There are a lot of options here, and even an extra section which acts like a gallery for players to look at concept art and sprite designs. Nice. Now there is so much to address here. It is tough to do a video on a game that was 26 years in the making. We have a lot to get through today. This obviously includes the characters themselves. Initially, at the beginning of a playthrough, gamers have the choice of 4 different fighters, each of whom have their own unique moves, abilities and advantages control-wise. So, let's cover who's featured in this game. First, we have Axel Stone from the original entry in the series. Due to the 10-year storyline gap between this game and Streets of Rage 3, he's depicted as older and more grizzled this time, featuring a massive beard. Classic character Blaze also makes a return to this game, not looking wildly different than before, but perhaps having much thicker legs and hips. Childbearing, in fact. The other 2 instantly selectable characters are brand new to the franchise. First, we have the heavyweight of the game, Floyd, a softly spoken, cybernetically enhanced apprentice of Dr. Zan, who was one of the playable fighters from the 3rd entry in the series. And we have a young woman known as Cherry Hunter, who, as you can guess by her surname, is a relative of Adam Hunter, who was only previously playable in the first game in the series 33 years ago. The story soon reveals that Cherry is Adam's daughter, and speaking of Adam, he quickly becomes a selectable fighter too, and the game's first unlockable character. Playable fighters don't end here though, and pixel art versions from previous games can also be unlocked as players build up their lifetime score. both embracing and celebrating the franchise's storied history. While most of the previous game's characters are selectable in pixel form, I was disappointed that Rue and Ash weren't included. Instead, they were reduced to cameos, with Rue featuring behind the bar in one stage, and Ash appearing in the picture in the background whilst one of the boss fights takes place. Considering the push for modern DEI in games, I demand they bring Ash back this instant. Looking at the artwork in the game, I can fully appreciate how it is not for everyone, but at the same time I can also sympathise with the fact that the original Streets of Rage games only featured the pixel art style due to the extreme limitations technology provided artists with in the early 90s. So when you consider that the original Streets of Rage trilogy were Japanese games, the manga sort of aesthetic that was given to this game makes a lot of sense. The only argument I place against this personally is that Streets of Rage was never that popular in Japan, and as I saw, was always more appealing to Westerners than it ever was to Easterners. So with this in mind, if I oversaw the production of this game, I would have certainly have ordered it to be produced with a more Western orientated art style, perhaps like the game was often depicted on its box art, but I am nitpicking at this point. I can see that it was a case of trying to reproduce the original artist's designs with a more modern flair. The stage design itself is both beautiful and varied, with a level of detail we obviously just did not get back in the day. The hand-drawn artwork is simply stunning, especially when paired with the multi-layered scrolling effects the game presents in its backgrounds. There is just so much to see and take in that I feel is going to take dozens upon dozens of playthroughs to ever truly fully appreciate. In terms of the game's enemy sprites, many of them appear to be redrawn versions of enemies of old, which helps give the game an additional layer of nostalgia for those who have been long-time fans, but at the same time enough polish to please those who have never played a game like this before. Like Streets of Rage of old, each of these levels have their own boss fights, each of which have their own unique attack patterns, which must be learned by players in order to be more easily defeated. Many of these boss fights take place against completely new opponents, whereas others take place against classic opponents of old. In fact, one of these opponents is even Max, a beloved playable character from Streets of Rage 2, who must be defeated here, but we will touch more on his appearance in the game very shortly. Something we have not touched upon really is this game's story, which revolves around another criminal organisation, this time known as the Y Syndicate, who even seem to have the police wrapped around their fingers. Speaking of this element, this brings another feature along with it. The game seems to contain two different types of enemy sprites, those who are members of the Y Syndicate and those who are in the police. These two types, although both hostile to the player, are also hostile and attack one another, an element I have not seen in a beat 'em up since Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, and certainly a feature I have never seen included in any of the Streets of Rage games previously. It unfolds in the story that the leaders of the Y Syndicate are a twin brother and sister, who are actually the son and daughter of Mr. X himself, which is why they are so hell-bent on getting revenge against the city. Again, just a personal gripe with regards to these two, they are not at all imposing like their father, but instead look anime as hell and simply look like selectable characters from a Persona game or something, rather than a title with a bit of early 90s attitude to it, like Streets of Rage. Once again, I am nitpicking here, but I feel they seem completely out of place in this environment. Speaking of Mr. X, he along with several other vintage bosses from the Streets of Rage series are accessible to fight against in pixel form. These fights are accessible via entering the secret areas and featuring the game as fantastic hidden Easter eggs, giving an even further nod to the franchise's awesome past. Now, we touched on the game's controls earlier and how they connected back to Streets of Rage 2, but what I have not mentioned is how they feel. The controls paired with the game's sound effects and combo system make Streets of Rage 4 feel like one of the most satisfying beat 'em up experiences I have ever had. It feels so good to pummel opponents, watching that count quickly mount up. Truly wonderful. A question I posed in the past was that I was doubtful that Streets of Rage 4 could live up to the fantastic fan game known as Streets of Rage Remake. However, from my findings, from my personal perspective at least, I can 100% confirm it absolutely does. Streets of Rage 4 is just so addictive. It's simply stupendous. While the base release of Streets of Rage 4 is excellent in its own right, in 2021, 1 year after its debut, the Mr. X's Nightmare DLC would see release that would expand on the game even further. Set after the events of Streets of Rage 4, the fight continues in Wood Oak City, with our heroes wanting to prepare themselves for future threats. Axel, Blaze and friends start some very deranged special training with the help of Dr. Zan of Streets of Rage 3 fame, who built an AR program from the remnants of Mr. X's brain that simulates every kind of danger they could be facing. The release of this DLC marked a significant milestone in the ongoing evolution of the title, a game that itself served as a revival of the iconic Streets of Rage series. This expansion not only enriches the game's narrative and aesthetic elements, but also introduces substantial gameplay enhancements that redefine the player's experience too, so let's touch on some of these glorious extra inclusions. A central feature of Mr. X's Nightmare is the introduction of 3 significant new playable characters, each with a distinct combat style and backstory. First, there's Estelle, previously encountered as a boss in the main game. Her transition from antagonist to playable character adds depth to the roster with her brute force and commanding presence. More to my taste, Max Thunder, a nostalgic addition from earlier series entries, brings raw power and wrestling technique that appeals to veteran players. And Shiva, also formerly an adversary, offers agility and swift flowing combos, creating a contrast in styles that enhances strategic choices in gameplay. Bearing in mind that both of these 2 fighters were previously playable in earlier installments, my predictions that they would one day be playable after appearing as boss characters in the base game would very much become a reality with Mr. X's Nightmare. Aside from getting to play as this trio, arguably the most engaging addition to this DLC is the survival mode. This mode challenges players to endure increasingly difficult waves of enemies, where each round introduces random power-ups and obstacles. The unpredictability and escalating difficulty of survival mode not only tests the player's adaptability and skill, but also significantly increases the replay value of the game. This mode serves as a perfect complement to the game's traditional linear storytelling by offering a dynamic arcade-like experience that varies with each session. It's jolly good fun. On top of all of this, Mr. X's Nightmare significantly expands the game's arsenal and movesets. New weapons like the Lightning Orb and Ghost Chaser add more tactical variety, allowing players to experiment with different approaches to combat. The inclusion of these elements encourages creativity and strategic planning, pushing players to develop new combinations and techniques tailored to their playstyle. Building on all of this further, the DLC also introduces a new layer of customization, permitting players to modify their favourite characters with alternate moves. This feature not only personalises the gameplay experience, but also encourages experimentation, making it possible to adjust characters for different tactical advantages. Additionally, the DLC includes enhanced animations and graphical improvements that refine the game's visual appeal, ensuring that the aesthetic evolution matches the gameplay depth. Music has always been a hallmark of the Streets of Rage series, and Mr. X's Nightmare continues this tradition with new tracks that complement the intense action. The soundtrack blends electronic beats with nostalgic motifs, capturing the essence of the urban combat narrative. Alongside the auditory enhancements, the DLC also enriches the game's environments and character designs, adding to the immersive experience. Mr. X's Nightmare DLC is not just an addition to Streets of Rage 4, but the perfect content that revitalises the entire game and makes it worth a revisit after a long break away from it. By introducing new characters, an innovative game mode, expanded weaponry and customization options, the DLC significantly broadens the scope and depth of the game. It enriches the player's experience by offering new challenges, strategic diversity, and replayability, thus securing the game's place in the modern landscape of beat-em-ups. Through these enhancements, Mr. X's Nightmare does more than extend the life of Streets of Rage 4, it elevates the entire series to a new level, honouring its legacy while paving the way for future innovations even further. But that's enough about my thoughts for now. Let's have a look at what the major game publications made of this game on release. IGN would state Streets of Rage 4 is a faithful revival of the classic arcade beat-em-ups. Move from left to right, punch enemies, destroy objects for points, health and weapon pickups, punch a few more enemies and repeat. It's simple and unadorned, and while it expands modestly on combat with a few new skills to master, Streets of Rage 4 definitely prioritises nostalgia over any kind of big modern reinventions. Streets of Rage 4 delivers the greatest hits of the classic series. and is at its best when played with at least one friend. If a primary focus was delivering a traditional Streets of Rage experience with a modern coat of paint, it absolutely succeeds, but while it layers on a few new and interesting mechanics, it's still a very conservative update to the quarter-century-old format that feels like a slave to the past. So, as you can see, IGN would give this game a very average response, awarding the game a 7 out of 10. Heavily criticising the game due to a lack of reinvention and too much nostalgia reliance according to them. But as you know what they say, you can't spell ignorant without IGN. And I, on the other hand, could not feel that their statement is further from correct. As a man who has been looking at beat-em-ups on here for years, I can certainly confirm that this game does not present players with just a nostalgia trip. In fact, as I've mentioned earlier, the game adds enough that it very much feels like something new, and in fact, very little like what was available in the 90s. In my opinion, Streets of Rage 4 built on the old formula and modernises it for new players. The fact that the game features save states so that players are not expected to finish the game in one sitting, contains a boatload of achievements for repeat play, and features an easy mode so that players can beat the game in just over 1 hour, if they choose to do so, is enough reasons alone to suggest that the game is certainly not a nostalgia trip, but instead looking to cater to modern gaming habits. An arcade mode is present for those who do want an old school arcade experience, but the game certainly seems designed for everyone, rather than just us old boys. The game perfectly marries up some of the tropes of the classic beat-em-up genre with a modern art style, new play mechanics, and a plethora of reasons to play through the same stages over and over. IGN would ignorantly add that beat-em-ups were simply about relentless challenge and pattern memorization. Let's be fair, there are clearly a lot more layers than that present here, and in the greats of old as well for that matter. So I am not quite sure what IGN was smoking when reviewing this high quality product. Destructoid summarised their findings too, adding that over 25 years since its last official entry, Streets of Rage is finally ready to make its long-awaited, highly anticipated return. The 16-bit era was an entire lifetime ago, and action games have advanced far beyond for traditional arcade brawlers of yore. Is there even a place for Blaze and crew in the modern gaming age? You bet there is, Jack. It's almost impossible to imagine a Streets of Rage devotee not being delighted with this sequel. It has the depth of combat and variance of character for dedicated fans to sink their teeth into, while at its chaotic, quick-fix action and co-op multiplayer offers even the most casual enthusiasts a solid experience. Streets of Rage 4's gratifying gameplay and fair price tag make this purchase worth anyone's cash. Streets of Rage 4 is an absolute triumph. It looks stunning, it sounds sublime, and it plays like a dream. Streets of Rage 4 delivers fistfuls of knockdown, drag-out action for fans old and new, all at a modest price. It's been a long wait for the Streets of Rage faithful, but comebacks rarely get much better than this. So at least we have one sensible take from a game journalist, I suppose. To see Streets of Rage 4 as merely a nostalgia trip like IGN did is ludicrous. Looking at the review scores across the board, the games received mostly critical love, with most big game publications falling into the same boat as myself and Destructoid. It was only a few rogues who didn't get the concept. Still, reflecting back on this game, now years after its release in its own right, it still gets a massive thumbs up from me. And I now trust Dotemu, Lizardcube and Guard Crush Games to bring me more great beat-em-ups in the future.
The last decade has spoiled us with some incredible beat-em-ups, so don't forget you can grab some of the best at huge discounts. How about 60% off Streets of Rage 4, up to 78% off River City Girls, or the thrilling Double Dragon Gaiden slashed by 80% to just $5.19. Plus, with my affiliate links, you can get up to 90% off thousands of other games too. Don't miss out, treat yourself, now's the time to do it. Yeah, cheerio.